Second day for the Forum on E-Voting. Today, we are going to begin with the table known as electronic voting and IT security. So we have Claudia Zavala Perez as our moderator for today. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Good day to all the people who are with us today. I kindly greet you all. It's a great joy to me to be with all of you who have analyzed this topic that is so relevant. Today is our second day for this forum of e-voting possibilities and challenges for its implementation in Mexico. So today we have an amazing table, electronic voting and IT security. So that is our topic for today. The purpose of this session is to share an analysis and reflection on aspects that should be considered for the instrumentation of e-voting from the perspective of IT security, considering, among other aspects, the independence of voting mechanisms, the characteristics of the potential security protocols for all the tools that are linked to e-voting, as well as the updating requirements to strengthen the software and hardware security, as well as auditing mechanisms for these IT systems. To meet this objective, today in this table, we have Jose Reynoso Nunez. I am not going to read the resumes. I think we should listen to what we have to say instead. You can find the summaries in the information of our forum. We also have the presence of Jordi Barrat, and I think we can see you on the screen. We have Jorge Torres Antuñano, who is our head of IT security in INE. We also have Carlos Ramon Guevara and Ricardo Andres Cacho Garcia. I cordially welcome you all to this institution, to all the people who are watching us via internet. So I invite you to pay attention and ask questions. Our voices should be heard. So if you have any questions, please pose your questions. So those who are kind enough to participate in the table, I want you to know that you have maximum 15 minutes to present your ideas. The purpose is that we will also be able to have a Q&A session at the end, and then you will be able to answer any questions that are posed to you. So I will be moderating the time. I have this role as a moderator. So without further ado, I want to also greet Manuel Carrillo. I can see you there. He is always backing us up in these events. So he also welcomes all of us, and I also want to greet all of my electoral counselors as well as the president to this institute. So I'm going to begin by giving the floor to Jose Reynoso Nunez. You have a maximum of 15 minutes to present your ideas. Thank you very much, Claudia Zavala, for the introduction. I want to say thank you to Carla Humphrey, who is the chair of the Organization for Electoral Organizations, and also to our president, Councilor Lorenzo Cordova. I want to greet all the members of this panel. It's a great pleasure to be able to share the table with you. When I received the invitation to participate in this event, what came to my mind was the first approach of e-voting that I had. I share it because I consider it relevant. I was appointed electoral counselor in Jalisco in 2014, and I found out that they had developed an e-ballot box. And I thought that it was something that should be promoted. And I even talked about this with Mr. Nolan, who is my PhD dissertation advisor. And the professor told me about the risks of this topic. First of all, because e-voting has many issues regarding hiring e-ballots. when foreign countries try to sell technology to the electoral institutions of countries with emerging democracies. Number two, he said, there is no better solution than paper and pens to be able to vote. That has been empirically proven. So this first approach to e-voting affected the way I felt about it. So after I've said this, I want to say that I'm going to make a presentation in three aspects: the paradox of e-voting, number two, the debate in Mexico and the importance of comparison, and thirdly, conclusions. Three challenges: technology, confidence, and political culture. So I'm going to begin with the first topic, the paradox of e-voting. Within the general knowledge of e-voting, we have two assumptions. The first is that technological progress of the technical era is present in all areas and it allows for the implementation of e-voting following the principles of free voting. Secondly, e-voting is a reality in democratic regimes. The paradox comes with the statement that even though they seem plausible, they haven't been able to be done empirically. So for decades, countries have tried to introduce these mechanisms, but many of them have backed off, especially in Europe. Currently, e-voting is done locally in some countries, and others, there are plans, pilot programs, and in very few countries, it's used nationally. I go to the second part of my presentation, the debate in Mexico and the importance of comparison. From my perspective, the dominating debate in Mexico is based on these assumptions and not compared empirical data. That's why it's so relevant that we are participating in this forum. With those cases that only talk about the successful cases, they do not include the issues that other failed processes have failed. And supposedly, we should be able to do e-voting. So it assumes that industrialized countries that have strong democracies vote through e-voting. And this focus tells us that Mexico cannot be left behind. This vision talks about modern democratic development with e-voting. However, like I already said in the paradox, empirical evidence shows something totally different. As an example of this dogmatic vision, I respectfully want to refer to two agreements of INE. One, where they approved guidelines for e-voting in some polling stations for 2020 in Coahuila and Hidalgo, that were replicated in the agreement for setting up e-polling stations in Jalisco 2021. I quote, "For many years now, voting through e-ballots is a reality in many countries because internet and telecommunications has allowed for it. With the use of e-ballot box, it's a reality, and throughout time, we see that it has become more present in some democracies of the world." And then at the bottom, there is a note referring to the following countries: Argentina, Germany, Australia, Belgium, Brazil, Canada, Colombia, Ecuador, the US, Estonia, Arab Emirates, Philippines, Finland, France, Guatemala, the Netherlands, India, Ireland, Japan, Kazakhstan, Norway, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, Venezuela, and Switzerland. With all due respect, I have to say that with this information, there is a lacking of differentiation and comparison to be able to take advantage of these compared experiences. I cannot explain the situation of each of all these countries. I'm just going to refer to two cases, the Netherlands and Germany. The Netherlands and the secrecy of voting.
Perdón, doctor, por ahí tenemos un micrófono abierto, si lo podemos cerrar, por favor. Adelante, doctor, disculpa.
I apologize, there was a microphone open. Okay, so I'm referring to the Netherlands and the secrecy of voting. In the Netherlands, for 40 years, they used e-ballot boxes. And just like Huub Schuurmans states, in March of 2006, there was a public debate regarding the security and integrity and reliability of these voting machines. And they said, we do not trust the voting machines. And so they began with this debate. The purpose of the foundation, created by a group of experts that come from ASTID with the legal backup and thinkers, created a public debate regarding the reliability of voting machines. So the foundation bought voting machines to examine them. In a TV program, this foundation showed how it was possible to alter the memory of the voting machines. And so they proved by this that they could not guarantee the privacy of votes. So there was a very important political issue created after this. In 2009, after a group of experts analyzed it, all the Dutch municipalities went back to manual voting for the parliament in 2009. In the following years, they created new commissions of experts that tried to use other mechanisms to reintroduce e-voting in the Netherlands. But up to the recent elections in 2021, they still have not been able to do it. So now I'm going to refer to some relevant conclusions of these commissions that can be useful for the discussion of this table regarding e-voting and IT security. It was proven that the radiation produced by voting machines can be collected abroad and put at risk the risk of privacy of votes. So that way they knew who voted for who. They could determine what was the political party that was winning through audio signals that could be captured meters away from the machine. In 2014, the Dutch government considered that it was not possible to completely cover e-voting, the risk of violating the secrecy of voting. In August of 2017, the government informed the chamber of these studies regarding voting and votes being counted in 2016. In summary, it says that the group of experts informed that it seems feasible to be able to determine the requirements needed, but also be very specific regarding the dissemination of the code of sources and with a drastic increase in the cost of elections. In an article published in March 21, and I mentioned this so we can see how novel this topic is, the Dutch newspaper presented an article, why can't we have voting machines in 2021? And Peter Sable states that paper voting is truly anonymous and that electronic voting cannot guarantee the secrecy of voting and that any computer can be hacked. And that if you vote electronically, you have to confirm it manually because you cannot confirm what the software is doing. He also states that for now, the Electoral Council sees no reason to reintroduce voting machines. So this is how I conclude what has happened in the Netherlands up to recently. This description catches our attention because this is a country that already used e-voting for almost 40 years and then suspended it. That's why it's so important to make this reference when we talk about possibly introducing e-voting in Mexico. Now I'm going to talk about Germany because it's very important regarding the ruling of 2019. In 2 million inhabitants, they voted through machines, and it was produced by NEDAP, a Dutch company, and they were distributed in Germany since 1999. Two citizens contested the e-voting system, and the Constitutional Court said it was inconstitutional. I'm just going to mention a few arguments that I think are relevant. The court said that the use of electoral machines is incompatible with Article 38 regarding 20 and paragraph 1 and 2 of the fundamental law because they cannot ensure any control regarding the elections. Also, the use of voting machines was not compatible with Article 38 regarding also Article 20 of the fundamental law and the principle of dissemination orders that all the essential steps of the elections have to be publicly controlled to the extent that other constitutional instruments do not justify an exception. Also, the use of electoral machines that can record votes electronically and they can determine these results is only compatible through very strict conditions. By using electronic machines, we should be able to check all the essential steps of the voting and the determination of the results in a reliable way and without even having specialized technical education. I conclude the German ruling by saying that the arguments of this ruling are still in force and they should be taken into account if we consider e-voting in Mexico. We should analyze if the citizens that don't have any technical preparation can be able to understand what is happening with their vote when they present their vote in an electronic ballot box. As we can see, there are compared experiences that show issues with e-voting, and Mexico cannot close their eyes to this. The implications go to a key point in our situation, lack of trust. The problem of hacking and violations is not an exclusive problem of the Netherlands. A decade ago, the CISA report, which is the cybersecurity department of the US in 2022, talks about the Georgia systems and says that first of all, you could remotely hack the machines if they used a USB to transfer information from one device that's connected to internet. Secondly, there was vulnerability with physical access to the machines to be able to infect the device and then move it on to others through USB memory sticks. And they could change the votes by doing this. And thirdly, they could restart it with Android mode and have total control over these devices. So they could show secrets that should be protecting elections. So I now want to mention my conclusions that have to do with technology, competence, and political culture. First of all, technology. E-voting in Mexico should consider that technology covers the principles of suffrage that have to do with privacy and transparency. According to the Dutch and German experiences, privacy and transparency cannot be guaranteed with e-voting. The second challenge, competence. The Dutch experience tells us how important it is when we see that the starting point that has been adopted by one of the researching commissions was just there to show us that trust is the most important condition for a democratic state. The implementation of e-voting in Mexico should consider that if the lack of trust that we have in e-voting is the best idea for Mexico, because we have to have the condition of competence as the starting point. And thirdly, political culture. The Dutch and German experiences show us how it was just enough to have a lack of competence to destroy the e-voting. The implementation of e-voting in Mexico would have to consider if the lack of trust and lack of acceptance of electoral results on behalf of political parties and the litigation that occurs are the best options for these types of contexts. Thank you very much for your attention, and this is how I conclude my participation. Thank you very much, Jose Reynoso. It's a great pleasure to hear your reflections that are very well informed and that you put us into context, and we can see that an analysis has been performed in other countries. And that's what this forum is about, to understand the challenges and possibilities that we have in the face of the challenges that we have environmentally and many aspects where we continue improving going forward. And it's clear to us, and we need to know the difference with these examples and to put into context the models that we are going to build, as well as all the reflections. And it will be part of the analysis for the following presentations. So if you have any questions, please share them so we can put them in order and include them in the Q&A session. So now we give the floor to Jordi Barrat. The floor is yours. You have a maximum of 15 minutes to present your ideas. Thank you very much. First of all, I want to say thank you to the Institute, to the organizers of this event. As some of you already know, I am linked to Mexico, so it's always an honor to be able to participate in these types of events. So without further ado, I'm going to share some of the ideas I have. The truth is that I have truly enjoyed being able to participate in this discussion regarding IT security. First of all, I need to express that I am not an expert in IT security. I am not an IT engineer. I am a professor of constitutional law. But that's why I am so excited to be here, because I have always stated throughout the years I have worked in e-voting that this area, this field of analysis, will not come to a good solution if we only focus it on unilateral perspectives, saying if we only talk about cryptography and IT or just on legal aspects, it's not going to work. We need to be interdisciplinary in the way we approach it. That's why I'm going to try to contribute my vision regarding how we should focus on IT security and e-voting. It's obvious that e-voting will only be accepted if it's safe and robust. But is that enough? No, it isn't. It has to be secure and perceived as secure on behalf of citizens. It has to be perceived as secure by our voters. And this is completely different, right? Because here I am talking about not only the perception of general e-voting, but the perception that voters have regarding the security of e-voting, the IT security. So it's that connection between the technical aspects as well as the social perception of competence that the previous speaker was referring to. I think that that's the path we have to follow to find a solution. I had notes prepared, and one of the things I was going to mention was the ruling of Germany of 2009, where obviously we do mention it. And the court says, look, I don't care what the technical characteristics of the system are. I don't care if the e-voting got a Nobel Prize. It doesn't really matter. What's important is that the citizens are convinced about this. And that's why you have to have mechanisms of oversight, of control regarding what is happening. And the answer cannot be that it's just necessary to study IT engineering to understand the security of the system. No, to the contrary, we have to find mechanisms so that a common citizen without this preparation, for example, myself, I do not know about cryptography, so we have to understand these systems. And secondly, I am going to replicate what has been said, and engineers can contradict what I am saying, but I have heard it many times, and I don't think I'm mistaken to state that 100% security is never accomplished. I mean, you have a lack of confidence of those sellers, of those speakers that say it's 100% secure. There are never going to be mistakes. That's not the case. As far as I understand, IT engineering, IT systems are not built based on that. That's not the case. They are built based on a risk calculation, a calculation of probabilities, meaning it's quite remote that we will have an error. There is a remote possibility that things will not go well. 100% security, no IT engineer can guarantee it. And I think we must take that into account because many times the solutions to e-voting is not a radical yes and no. We have to like move in these different areas. I think a clear example and not very quoted regarding this calculation of risks is cryptographic protection. You have all these guarantees that are stated and offered in any e-voting systems. They say we have cryptographic protection and we have codes that are divided. We have custodians and that are rebuilt and this and that. And so it offers this amazing protection. Is it secure, robust? Maybe today, yes, but maybe tomorrow, no. And in 10 years, it won't be that way because as the progress of IT occurs, well, of course, it's quite probable that that capacity will be overcome and can be broken down. The cryptographic security can be violated and you violate the secrecy of vote. So the protection of the secrecy of vote in the long term. So I'm just saying that I think this is a very good example of how it's a mistake to say, oh, it's completely safe or there are mistakes or there aren't. We must understand these dynamics, this logic of working of IT engineers. And also it's very convenient when we analyze IT security for us to compare what is happening in other places. Is there 100% security in paper? No, of course not. There are errors in all elections, even in the most advanced systems. Obviously, this exists. Maybe we can find differences in the type of errors that take place on paper. Maybe they're not as scalable because on paper we can find an electoral polling station that has an accumulation of errors, but you do not automatically replicate that in the other polling stations. But when we talk about e-voting, one error can have much more massive consequences for sure. But what is true is that we should avoid this type of approach with this idea that we are going to find a completely reliable, robust system, 100% error free. No. Yes, of course, it has to be reliable. It's obvious. I'm not saying the contrary. I'm just saying that we cannot be so absolute in what we say. Okay, IT security. What do we want to guarantee with e-voting? What are the principles and the basic aspects that we are interested in? Well, first of all, we want a system that works. Of course, sometimes it doesn't even work. There are servers that are saturated, break down. We have a blackout, whatever. So we are going to use a starting point that operationally speaking, the system works. And we have had more lines of connection, the data has been shared, the computers work in the house and the different polling stations, etc. That is something that we take for granted.
I insist sometimes that's not the case. And we have some failures in the case of e-voting and that have occurred. The previous speaker has already talked about the failures in e-voting systems. I insist on that because that happens. So that's okay, but we should also look at success stories as well as failures because that can help us when it comes to implementing these systems in our own countries. So e-voting has worked, technically speaking, it's not a problem. I mean, screens were on, but let's see. When it comes to IT security, what's the purpose? I would basically say that we have two aims. One of them, the first one, which I would like to mention is where, in addition, I believe that we have made a lot of progress. For example, beginning in 2007 in the Netherlands, from an IT security level, there have been achievements or progress when it comes to finding solutions to problems that occurred in the Netherlands and Germany, including these challenges with the Constitutional Tribunal. But there is a second aspect that is typically overlooked that I believe is worth noting. First, we need to make sure that there's integrity of data in the system and electoral authorities, in this case, voters, political parties must have a certain level of certainty based on technical data, IT data, so that they are convinced that the votes cast by citizens are reflected in the final results of an election. I mean, that they have not been tampered with, that there are no additional or excess votes, that no votes have been removed or eliminated. I mean, so that you have one person, one vote. And the important aspect of a German sentence ruling is that, for example, we can not only confirm with data logs, but also other sources of information that the votes have been cast. And I would like to refer to two aspects. To analyze this matter, it's also important not to put all e-voting systems in the same bag or in the same basket, because they're all different. E-voting machines are different, but all of them should be able to issue a paper receipts or vouchers, which is the case in several countries. That can be of great help when it comes to solving or addressing this issue by providing citizens who do not have IT literacy proof, in the sense that the results are fair and in the case of remote internet voting systems where things get more complicated, I believe that advancements have been made, especially when it comes to the second generation of e-voting or internet voting, with the thorough point-to-point verifiability or end-to-end verifiability, which has been done in Estonia and other countries. And in that regard, I believe that a lot of progress has been made by providing voters proof that the vote has been cast the way they wanted, or proof that votes have been stored as they were cast, and then proof that votes have been counted as it was stored. So we're talking about three stages or phases where you may have errors, you may have attacks or cyber attacks, but these systems in general allow, at least in the two first phases, also in the third, but at least in the two first phases, they provide the reasonable understanding that that has not been the case and the system works. Let me talk about the second aspect, secrecy or anonymity. That's a more complicated aspect from my standpoint. Who can guarantee that nobody has had access to our vote or seen our vote? I mean, I'm talking about not only seeing, I'm talking about not tampering with it.
Permítame un segundo, doctor.
1 second, doctor. We have a mic open here. Can you help us,
Muchas
please?
gracias, doctor. Adelante.
Thank you, doctor. Go ahead, please. I'm talking about the fact that somebody can establish this connection and connect a given vote to a given person. For example, in the case of internet e-voting, you vote, the results must match the votes cast. You have a verification process end-to-end verifiability, but who can guarantee that we don't have a man in the middle, as IT experts call it, somebody in the middle of a circuit that just looking. I mean, cryptographic protection, yes, it works. That's okay, but those are technical aspects that I'm not, I don't have an obligation to understand. When it comes to e-voting machines, it's exactly the same situation. Who can guarantee that there is not a sequence? For example, in Venezuela in 2005, as expressed by the observation report of emissions from the EU, who can guarantee that the storage system in voting machines is really random? Well, we need an IT system. Yes, we need code, but I don't understand that code. That's a problem. That's a problem. There is no evidence. There is no proof. And no comprehensible proof. Are there solutions to that? Yes, there are. I believe that there are solutions. Some almost done. And but basically, I'm talking about audit trails, certification tests, or as we have seen today in Switzerland, penetration tests, so that these tests can verify whether things are working or not. And these tests should be open to different individuals. But what happens? Well, those audits, certifications, whatever you want to call them, must be well designed, because otherwise that may end up being a caricature of the ideal situation. And just to wrap up, I quote, and we can come back to it. But let me touch upon several questions that are essential to guarantee that these audits are conducted with the actual purpose, which is not only technical, by the way, with the purpose of guaranteeing to me, a layman, that things work. Who can conduct these audits? Who can select those responsible for conducting those audits? And what's the selection process? And who will pay these auditors if they are paid? What is audited? What will be audited and certified? A part of the system as a whole, in which in what conditions. And here I would like to point out that to this confidentiality document, that these non-disclosure agreements that are usually required by vendors to protect those systems. We're talking about confidentiality agreements, and oftentimes they're impossible to access. But if we don't have access to them, we won't know either the reach of data certification or auditing processes, or when it takes place. Is it based on the latest version of the system or previous version? But especially the principle of publicity. Who has access to those results? Because yes, you may say that there was a certification audit, but you must be able to request the corresponding report. But if you have obstacles to that access as a result of trade agreements, etc., that's not compatible with the purpose of these tests, which are aimed at the convincing me, or should be aimed at convincing me that the system works. That's basically what I wanted to share with you. But I'll be here available in case you have any further questions during the Q&A. Thank you, Dr. Jordi. I mean, I believe that your ideas and thoughts are really interesting, and there are material for review to make sure that citizens can understand these processes, so that we can develop the trust we need or not in e-voting systems. I want to take more time. And next, we have engineer Jorge Torres Santillano, who is the director of the IT systems department or division here at the National Electoral Institute. You have 15 minutes. Thank you, Counselor. Thank you to Mrs. Humphrey for the invitation to participate in this photo. And I will rely on the presentation that I prepared for this session to talk about this subject. And well, precisely in response to the invitation and the topic question, which is the area of e-voting and IT security, I would like to take into account several important concepts. Let me talk about the concept of IT security, which is part of this session. And I'll go or I'll rely I will rely on Wikipedia, which is an encyclopedia online. Uh, Wikipedia says that IT security, also known as cybersecurity, is the area related to computer processing and telematics that focuses on the protection of computer infrastructure and everything related to it, especially information contained or stored in a computer or circulating on computer networks. So IT security is aimed at seeking protection. In this sense, I believe that we should take into account the following. The question is, do we have international standards when it comes to IT security, when it comes to e-voting? The response is that there are no international standards when it comes to e-voting. However, we have recommendations and we have practices that have been developed internationally and as well as regionally. Along these lines, we have, for example, the Council of Europe, which in 2017 approved a series of recommendations known as standards for e-voting. And I would like to quote several parts of these recommendations. Again, this was done back in 2017. Along these lines, what they established in Appendix 1 are a series of standards for e-voting, which should be considered recommendations because they are not precisely binding. But the aim of this appendix is to provide some guidance. Well, these recommendations include aspects such as universal suffrage, equal suffrage, free suffrage, and secret suffrage, as well as regulatory requirements and organizational requirements. And it also deals with transparency and observation, responsibility and compliance with the standards and principles, and reliability and security of the system. I would like to reiterate that these are recommendations made by a committee of ministers of the Council of Europe, addressed or aimed at all the members of the Council of Europe, but they are recognized internationally. This may be recent, but it's already guidance in the sense that efforts are being made to improve e-voting systems. I agree with some of the previous speakers in the sense that there are several aspects that we should be careful with. In this Appendix 1, they also establish in paragraph 39 a precept or a provision that says that e-voting systems shall be auditable. This is an important aspect because at the end of the day, the fact that they are auditable will be useful so that e-voting systems are efficient, whether you're talking about e-voting ballot boxes or internet systems. But what should we understand by audit? Because we often associate audit with systems. The definition of this audit has to do with the systematic review of an activity or situation to evaluate the compliance with objective criteria or rules that they are subjected to, which means that we're not only talking about e-voting systems. These audits can be applied to any process or procedure, including traditional voting systems. There are some regional considerations. For example, in the case of the US through the Election Assistance Commission, we have a certification process applicable to e-voting systems. What you see on the screen is an example of what you will find in this document and the different steps to certify e-voting systems. It is worth noting that this is a standard that is mandatory internationally, which has to do with the regional circumstances. What are the main contributors to IT security? We're talking about two aspects, and here I'll agree with some aspects mentioned by Jordi: control trenches, better practices, and technologies. In the case of control trenches, what do we mean by that? We're talking about the different stages of a process where you have a person or a group of persons identified as being responsible for their implementation and, if applicable, their supervision. Why talking about control trenches? Because at the end of the day, implementing an electoral process, the implementation of an IT system to be able to carry out activities, including electoral processes or voting processes, requires persons. And to do that, you need precisely these control trenches that are controlled or led by people. I mean, if they are applied by persons, we need to rely on these individuals or groups of individuals so that they can carry out different activities. This extrapolated to the implementation of an e-voting system um, will lead us to three stages that, in my opinion, should be considered when it comes to the implementation of e-voting systems. By applying the experience of INE, one has to do with the implementation phase, and then we have a second phase, which is audit, and the third stage, which has to do with operations. These are not necessarily sequential stages. What do we mean by the implementation phase or stage when it comes to control trenches? Implementation should include risk analysis. Jordi already talked about it. This is essential. As a matter of fact, at a certain meeting with people who are experts in IT matters, we asked somebody, what's the level of security of your organization? And the response by this person was the following. And by the way, he was responsible for IT security. I believe that he was kind of an attorney or an attorney. He said, all risks that are known, we have under control. What does that mean? Known risks. There are unknown risks. And so here we need to stress that risk analysis should be multidisciplinary and as thorough as possible, not only to cover IT risks or risks in terms of environment or social risk or risks related to processes or procedure. I mean, you need to cover those risks. In the case of implementation, we also need to include the planning of all processes or procedures and actions to mitigate those risks. Also, purchases and contracting and development and implementation of e-voting system, as well as facilities and configurations and tests and simulations for any systems in question, especially when it comes to e-voting, which is the case in point. In this point, I would like to mention that when it comes to implementation and tests, we need unit and comprehensive tests that are iterative, applicable when it comes to functionality, including compliance with the regulations, standards and procedures, source code and functional tests, its capacity, the capacity of the system, storage, concurrent users, speed of transmission, among others, continuity, especially when it comes to operation mechanisms in response to contingencies of different types, as well as security, which has to do with the integrity, confidentiality, mitigation of vulnerabilities, and shielding systems against attacks. These tests must be carried out during the implementation stage to ensure reliability. Simulations are also substantial because in them, what you should do prior to implementing or operating a system is reproducing the totality of the processes exactly the way they will be implemented during the operation of the system. It should include the participation of all people responsible for each of the procedures and include the implementation of continuity and security plans in order to verify how the system behaves, how processes behave, and correct things before the operation of the system as such. These are substantial steps that are required during the implementation stage. When it comes to the audit stage, you need to cover processes and procedures, which has to do with implementation and operation of systems. That also should include source codes, black box tests with the final users, as well as vulnerability analysis in hardware and software, intrusion and service denial attacks tests mentioned by Jordi already. So these are aspects that should be covered during the audit stage. And in the case of operation, we should also take into account that there are control trenches when it comes to the installation or opening of polling stations, voting centers, and the implementation of systems in data processing devices to cast votes, opening and closing of votings, identifying voters, and tallying and aggregation of results. For all of these, you need control trenches. If these control trenches were managed by a single area or a person, that would be a problem because we need reliability and confidence. What can we do to increase the level of trust? We need to distribute these control trenches based on the fact that we have these three stages. So what we typically do is that you have a group responsible for the implementation phase, a second group for auditing, and a third group for the operation. I believe, and I would like to mention that these groups should be independent so that we can have an effective distribution between the different processes and accountability when it comes to what is being carried out. If we extrapolate this to actual processes, for example, internet voting, e-voting, and traditional voting. If you look at the traditional voting with the printed ballots, and you talk about implementation and audit, audits would be applicable to implementation and operation. What are the groups that you typically have? When it comes to implementation, you have electoral authorities. In the case of audit, you have political parties and observers, electoral observers, who are responsible for overseeing all the part prior to the implementation. And in the case of operations, these political parties and observers are overseeing the compliance with procedures. And in the operation, we also have citizens. What would be the case when it comes to e-voting machines? Well, in this case, we'll again have these three stages or phases where audit applies to both cases or the three aspects. In the case of electoral authorities, we not only have them related to the implementation, we also have hardware and software providers or manufacturers. In the case of the audit stage, we have voters, political parties, observers, and academic institutions and companies that will conduct specific audits on these voting systems. In the case of e-voting machines with paper proof mentioned by Jordi, for example, an auditor would be the voter himself or herself who can make sure that the vote they cast has a paper proof to show that the vote was cast in the machine. And in the case of operation, we also have citizens. In the case of internet voting, remote voting, if we look at these responsibility trenches or control trenches, and we look at the stages, again, we have audit applicable both to implementation and operation. And in this case, we literally have cases very similar to e-voting. In the case of implementation, we have electoral authorities together with hardware and software providers and manufacturers. In the case of audit, we have political parties, electoral observers, and possibly academic institutions or auditing firms that will be in charge of auditing these voting mechanisms. And again, as mentioned by Jordi, I mean, audits cannot be carried out by voters for the reasons he mentioned. And in the case of operations, when it comes to remote internet voting, we have citizens, but we also have the intervention of electoral authorities and the manufacturers or suppliers of hardware and software, considering everything that these type of systems entails. When it comes to technologies, mention was made of it, and technologies can improve IT security. And for that, we have cryptographics. Cryptography is a technique of codes and systems of ciphered writing to protect the storage or transmission of private data so that whoever doesn't have the key cannot decipher the information. How can a cryptography guarantee the secrecy of a vote? Well, it provides a secrecy of votes because if there's an electronic vault, it allows for integrity of data and the system integrity. Another technology that we use in the case of e-voting or internet voting systems is the use of blockchains, which is distributed and decentralized system to store transaction blocks and verify them against a network of nodes. What is the benefit of blockchain? Well, it has a log that cannot be tampered with on the actions carried out in the system with a timeline of these records and transactions with the intervention of administrators. When it comes to technologies to improve IT security, we have another element, which is cloud computing, which is something we use every single day, every time we access our email accounts or our backups of data on the cloud. And precisely, since systems have evolved a lot and companies perform or conduct audits of their own infrastructure, providing cloud services. One of the benefits of this system has to do with larger storage capacity as well as continuity of infrastructure and redundant regions. We have international computer centers that support us in our operations, and security, which involves the mitigation of service denial attacks. Is e-voting safe? Well, considering what Jordi just said, I would dare to say that yes, e-voting is safe. E-voting is safe. However, it is safe as long as you conduct a thorough risk analysis and you take into account the recommendations and, if applicable, national, regional, international standards. As long as you implement also good and best practices and you take into account international experiences, as long as you conduct audits by third parties with technical experience and capacity and publicly recognized, and as long as the implementation operation is made transparent to political actors and citizens in general. I mean, a system won't be 100% safe or secure, but if we conduct these activities, we can guarantee 99.9% security as long as we consider these aspects to consider in implementation of e-voting systems. And here I agree with Jordi. Well, an initial point would have to do with technical matters or aspects. I believe that the technical aspects in most cases cover many of the areas or requirements necessary for safe or secure systems. But we should also take into account economic or financial aspects as well as legal aspects. And finally, political aspects. And here is where the perception of trust Jordi referred to kicks in. This would be the conclusion of my participation, and I'll be available for questions. Thanks a lot, Engineer Jorge. There is no doubt that this was a great presentation, and the same applies to the comments. Actually, we have a lot of questions. In the next segment, we will address these concerns and comments in light of everything that you have shared with us. Um, for the sake of time, I'll give the floor to Mr. Carlos Ramon Guevara so that he can share his thoughts and his ideas on the next topic, and then we'll come back with a Q&A. Go ahead, please. We cannot hear you, and I don't see you here. Can you hear us? Yes, I apologize for the mistake. Small lapsus with the mute button. It happens to everyone, I guess. Well, thanks to all of you. First of all, I thank you for the time and the opportunity to be here. I believe that this is a great forum, and because I believe that it greatly reflects many situations that also happen in Panama, especially when we made the decision to find a solution in the area of e-voting that made sense for Panama. We actually started this process in 2010, and we have been working both in the area of internet voting solutions to facilitate the voting process for citizens in Panama. As a matter of fact, I mean, everything the previous speakers have said or mentioned are things that you need to consider. Actually, in the case of Panama, we had to take care of many of these aspects, or all of them. Panama is a small country with particular characteristics. And in the case of this participation, I would like to explain a little more about our process and how we mitigated the aspects or issues mentioned by previous speakers. And I use the word mitigate because Dr. Barat is completely right. You cannot create a 100% secure process, but you can work to mitigate the risks in the best possible fashion, making it difficult enough that there is no sense or it is not worth tampering with it. In the case of elections, these are important aspects that require um, a lot of consensus when it comes to solutions, working with the citizens, political parties, and experts. And that's what we did. The first thing we did was do a lot of research. And many of the things that you have talked about, like the case of Germany, and there are other more recent cases, but we also have cases in France and the Netherlands. We analyzed those cases to identify the risks or the vulnerabilities they found when it comes to these systems to try to address them. We also met with people working already in those areas, like people from Brazil or electoral authorities from Brazil and Peru. The Peruvian case is very particular. The OMBE, which is the electoral authority, was super kind, and they shared a lot of information, and we liked their approach to e-voting as an institutional affair, not as an IT aspect only. They involve the legal departments of the electoral authority, training departments, technical departments in those areas in charge of running elections themselves. And that helped us to create a working group to define or identify the problems we wanted to address or solve, and the requirements that existed, and identifying the risks associated with those requirements to assess the potential mechanisms to mitigate those problems. That led us to create an interinstitutional group, including experts in security, external consultants, international consultants, legal advisors, and training, to try to find solutions to the particular Panamanian problem. Because again, Panama is a small country with particular characteristics. To begin with, we only have a public national election every 5 years. We do not have intermediate elections. We do not have midterm elections. So we're talking about a single event every 5 years, which affected or had an influence on decision making for our teams and the way we approach things. We also wanted a solution that covered the whole election cycle, from the standpoint of verifying the identity of the citizens all the way from the moment that they showed up at the polling stations to the final stages. So we made the decision to create a solution within the electoral tribunal, as opposed to seeking third-party solutions, to be able to make sure that we had the right conditions that we wanted.
With specific requirements, like I was saying, we decided to have an app in the court with our own staff, with knowledge of our situation, with the support of external consultants. Since elections take place once every 5 years, to buy specialized equipment for e-voting was not a viable solution, because if you buy expensive equipment that you're only going to use once every 5 years, well, it would be affordable. So we just didn't think that we could justify the cost regarding its benefit. That's why I decided to use something commercial. In Panama, we use equipment that you can buy in any store. And so we had to investigate even more to ensure that this equipment that we were buying was secure enough. So we had to have reliable. The electoral court is used to working with contingencies. So, like Mr. Barat said, you can have a blackout. So we had to consider all of this in the development of our application. The whole team offered their requirements and specified that, for example, if we lost the app because we had a blackout or a problem in the machine, because it has happened. For example, once somebody knocked over the equipment, so we had to be able to set it up again and leave it exactly at the point it was before being knocked over. And an important topic that we have in Panama is that we do not have a software and hardware industry. We don't have local companies that could give us support. So this had an effect on what we were going to decide to use. In Panama, the software industry is more focused on tech in financial services for banks, etc. In Panama, we have companies like Microsoft that use .NET and Windows, and we don't have open source companies in Panama because we don't have the backup. So we decided to use a Microsoft solution, both in its operating system as well as the platform. So we also talked with external consultants as well as people with Microsoft so we could ensure that the equipment was as shielded as possible. First, we wanted to see the security of the information. We needed to use BitLocker. If somebody could go into the machine, if they did not follow the steps, it's encrypted. If somebody steals the disk, it's encrypted. We needed to have secure boot keys that are generated in an HDMI. And the idea is to avoid any possibility of manipulating this machine. Each machine has an SQL encryption at rest. Machines are not connected among each other or on internet at all. Each machine is independent, and the flow of information is something we will discuss in a few minutes. We also have a security backup with GPO, and the idea is that we could back it up completely. And we have to have peripheral security. We used Windows Enterprise in a kiosk methodology. We also use authorized USBs. We have smart cards. For example, if somebody comes to a machine and they want to enable a voting table, they have to have an admin card that has an encrypted key that allows that person that role. So that person can activate and configure the machine. All machines have the same software, and it's through different models that you have. You have verification machines, voting machines, etc. Like you know, one of the most important problems is to guarantee that the cast of votes be private. And so we follow many mechanisms to do so. First, we verify the identity of the person. The verification machine has the database of all the voter registry, and the person shows up and presents their ID. And with that, we can verify that that person has not voted and that votes at that polling station. Since the voting machines are not connected to the verification machines, the person gets an intelligent card and they get a one-use key so they can use this key and vote. If they put this key into the machine, this card is disabled and this person cannot vote again. Another advantage offered is that they go into the verification machine and they know which person is voting, and the voting machine has no relationship to this previous machine because all you have is a certificate from the polling station itself. The storing of information is in an encrypted database, and we also have a protection of the data of our voters, and then it also has an encryption of an HDMI, and it guarantees that this private key is never shared. So this key is private, and it's specifically for that event, and it's there for the polling station. So we save all the information in an encrypted way to ensure that it's not modified, to mitigate somebody modifying it. Okay, machines are all disconnected. The GPO disables everything that has to do with Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, or anything that allows for communication in a wireless manner. You can only communicate with USBs that are authorized with authorized software or through intelligent keys. Voting and counting. The data that is in the machine is collected through safe USBs. They are taken to the verification machine The verification machine is the only machine that can read these USBs for that polling station. And we obtain the information through intelligent keys or cards. So the admin has to go into the machine and enable it as a voting station. And then you get a partial result that has to match up with the verification machine. Then obviously what we add up in each machine has to coincide. Additionally to that, we have a printer in each one of the polling stations, and it generates a certificate. This certificate has all the information of the votes, and they can read this information and they can deposit it in a box that we have for auditing. So if somebody wants to audit a specific polling station, or the court decides to audit a certain polling station, we can compare what's on the machine with what's in the box. Additionally to this, another mechanism that we use to guarantee transparency, and this is a reason why we decided to create our own software and not use a third-party software, is that we wanted our software to be completely transparent. The source code is developed by the IT department of the electoral court, and then it's reviewed by consultants of security that is renowned worldwide. And for each event, we also choose another supplier to perform audits and assessments. And the Technological University of Panama, which is our main university, and IT also audits it. The source code is released as if it were an open code on the web page, so anybody can see it, as well as political parties. And we also present this information. For example, we can see this image of this woman voting who is very happy. So these are the mechanisms that we use to design and create e-voting. And that's how I conclude my intervention. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Mr. Carlos. Thank you for sharing your experience of Panama. And of us who have observed you have had the possibility of have had the opportunity to see how it works in practice and the model that you have chosen. And the truth is that with what was said previously by our speakers, we can begin to generate this correlation of security that exists, mechanisms that exist to guarantee votes under conditions of secrecy, universal, and authentic. So thank you very much. Now I am going to give the floor to Ricardo Andres Cacho Garcia to share his ideas. You have a maximum of 15 minutes. Hello, thank you very much, Counselor. Thank you, Ine, for this forum, for inviting me. Thank you to my co-panelists. It's such a great honor to be here with you. Carla Humphrey, of course, I send you my greetings. We have been in many international forums together. I respect her greatly. I want to begin by reading some phrases of a book. It's a failure without hopes. It's a failure that's notorious. It's badly designed, bad principles. It's only used to show how we're lacking good scientific reasoning. These are phrases that they stated about Thomas Alva Edison when he wanted to bring electricity to New York. In times when everything was lit up with gas lamps, And this discussion for me reminds me of the biography of Thomas Edison. It's very difficult to accept technological changes because it's natural to feel fearful towards changes and doing things in a different way that you've done for centuries. But technology is our ally, and it's our ally for many things, not only for efficiency and cost saving, but also to fight against corruption. I am convinced that e-voting is a need, is something that will happen sooner or later. It's unavoidable, and we have to be prepared to do it in the best way possible. Yes, I do want to be very clear in my position because it's partial in that regard. I am a loyal believer of this way of doing things, of backing up what we do with technology and address the problems that we currently have so we can resolve them with technology. Specifically, I'm going to talk about blockchain. It was already mentioned on behalf of some of my panelists. And I want to underline and highlight this technology because I think that this is a technology that will allow us to turn e-voting into a reality. And we have seen some ideas that it is possible. I think that in the coming years, and it will depend on the willingness of the people that are in charge of making decisions, will make it a reality because we will be able to see changes that we never imagined before. Of course, it's going to be difficult. Of course, we are going to have to adjust things, change things, adapt things, revise things. But I think we should go ahead and begin now so that in the coming elections that will occur again and again, we will be able to have maturity of voting in our country. With no doubt, it's very important to consider all these negative aspects. I understand the criticisms, I understand the failings of the first attempts. However, we are in a digital world and we get on planes that are controlled by digital systems. We go to hospitals that also have digital databases. Our national security agencies use digital systems, and of course, there are risks. However, we still get on planes, we still go to hospitals, and we use these resources every day with emails, with chats. We no longer send each other letters, even though it's very romantic. The great majority of us use emails to communicate, even though we can, of course, have risks of hacking, identity theft, but we take on these risks because we accept all the advantages of these technologies. So, what is blockchain? Blockchain is a decentralized system that cannot be altered, it cannot be forged, it's transparent and digital, public. I repeat, it's a decentralized, unviolatable, transparent digital system. That is the idea of blockchain. It began with Bitcoin, and it's the underlying basis to have a system to exchange monetary value. That's what it was created for a digital currency that would be controlled by nobody. Many of our co-panelists have mentioned this very important point, which is the fact that nobody can affect the way it operates. And that's the most important characteristic of blockchain. It does not have middlemen. It's revolutionizing the financial systems, monetary systems, as well as all industries where there is the existence of somebody who is in the middle. And how does this decentralization work? Well, it works through democratization. And that's why it's so wonderful to talk about blockchain in a forum of elections, because the conception itself of blockchain is based on democracy. That's its philosophy, that's its basis, that's its most important foundation. Why? Because we have thousands of computers throughout the world that validate each operation that takes place in the blockchain. Thousands of computers that can be of a citizen, a government, a company, whoever, and they are spread out throughout the world. And that's why it becomes unchangeable. Somebody said nothing is absolutely unchangeable. Of course, we can have a possibility of 0.00 something that it can be mutable, because you have thousands of people that come together and simultaneously they are attacked physically and technologically. However, up to today, it has not happened. And all the great hackers of the virtual world have tried to hack blockchain and they haven't been able to do it. And I think it could be an incentive to accomplish it, but nobody has been able to do it. And this is because it's democratic. That's why it's not changeable, because nobody controls it, because it's validated through thousands of computers. How did it begin? It began as a currency, but blockchain has evolved to other concepts, specifically with other types of technologies, or another cryptocurrency. It's known as Ether. And this cryptocurrency was designed to include additional information to just a currency, which is what Bitcoin did. So when Ethereum begins, it begins under the conception that we include information of all types in each block that authorizes these operations. It's done by thousands of computers. And we have like intelligent contracts. What is an intelligent contract or smart contract? It's just a programming that is foreseen in the blockchain and that it works by itself. So once you start up a smart contract, this smart contract can work without the intervention of any human being. This can be used for all types of financial operations, for contracts, for doing business, for betting, for example. If I want to bet that Pumas is going to beat Barcelona, and when the soccer match is over, and unfortunately we got 6 goals against us, the bet is going to auto execute. The money that I betted with the person that I betted with is going to be auto executed, and that person will receive the money of that bet, and I will lose the money that I had, because the smart contract does it automatically. And we only maintain it in function if the blockchain works in a democratic way through thousands of computers. That is the idea. And one of the first proposals that was made to make it socially function in its origin was the voting system. That was the first thing that was defended, and today it's beginning to be implemented in some places of the world for it to be used socially through votes. Each vote is saved on the blockchain. It's immutable. Nobody can modify it, alter it. And the smart contract in the blockchain adds up all the votes that are counted in a country or state, and it gives us the final result automatically. Nobody can alter anything. Nobody can violate the system. Nobody can change the result that is there foreseen. Nobody even has to count. There are no human errors or whatever. It is going to be done automatically. That is the beauty of the blockchain system. And also, it follows another important concept, which is digital identity. The identity of each citizen can be included on blockchain. So we can all have our identity in an immutable way, backed up in the blocks of one of the existing blockchains. Nobody can manipulate it either. And these have a beautiful quality. You can decide what is public and what is private. For example, I vote, and you can decide that the vote as a number and statistic be public. And any person in the world can see the vote there of a chain, of a QR, or whatever. However, you cannot know who cast that vote. Who is the digital identity behind that vote? And that's why I think that through digital identity and blockchain and through voting through blockchain and smart contracts, we can eliminate many of the problems that currently exist in eras of elections. This is a technology that is being adopted in Japan, in some US counties, in Estonia. Estonia has been a leader in this technology system. In Brazil, they're also going to start with a pilot program. And yesterday, there was a report saying that Google, Samsung, BlackRock, American Express, Goldman Sachs, etc., have invested billions and billions of dollars in this technology because it's a revolutionary technology. And this is just the beginning. I think that this is a forum where we can explore these ideas. And what's even more important, we can be leaders in Mexico for the implementation of these types of technological solutions for things that are so important, such as the democracy of a country. We truly can be leaders here. We do not have to wait for other countries to do it or other companies to have blockchain, and then later we raise our hand. That's why these forums are so important. I congratulate the organizers, I congratulate INE, and I thank you for the invitation. Thank you very much, Ricardo. Thank you for sharing your conviction and vision and opening up this discussion on this topic. We do not have a lot of time, so I'm going to be very specific with my questions. Some of the questions are very specific for some speakers, and I think that each person will be able to know what question is for them. For example, I have some directly for Jorge. We have to conclude in 10 minutes. So I kindly ask you to use a maximum of 3 minutes in answering. For Mr. Reynoso, how is paper safer than a device? Paper is so fragile. Is it unchangeable? And we also have a question. How would you work on the lack of confidence in politics in Mexico? Jorge, we have some questions for you as well. We have some that say, what is your opinion regarding security measures in the electronic ballot boxes in Mexico? What are the security codes, the physical seals, external audits, etc.? And this is a more general question. Is it viable to have e-voting through SMS messages or QR codes and to eliminate the electronic ballot box in the case of votes on mobile devices or computers? Would INE protect all this information? And this is a question for you. Why did you request for a reserve when they asked you for publicity? And this is a question or a comment for Mr. Ricardo and any other person at the table, because they say that in the voting system in Russia 2021, they used blockchain and that it was hacked by a personal laptop in France. Could you talk about this? And another question is, how can we communicate to citizens the virtues of blockchain in a citizen language? How can it be more accessible? And this is to have the confidence among our citizens. And Jorge, can you answer if the audits of the voting are the same as the prep? Could you please answer this question? And we are also being requested information of the microsite. The microsite has been enabled. It's at enet.mx forum for e-voting. The presentations that have been shared will also be available on this microsite, as well as all the things that we have been talking about. The microsite will have the full contents next week. So next week, please visit the microsite to see this information. So with these questions, with these debates and reflections, I now give the floor to all our speakers. Also, the panelists can decide what you want to answer. You have a maximum of 3 minutes. So let's follow the same order that we had in our participation. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Mrs. Claudia. Regarding the question about paper, why is it safe? Because it's anonymous. A voter will get into or enter the polling station, and they can cast their vote in secret. And for that reason, it has been a solution probably safer. When it comes to the political culture, I believe that the political culture can change in the long and midterm through a civic education, which has been done by electoral authorities in some countries, even though it's a long-term process. It's a structural change that takes time. In addition to these questions, I would like to conclude with some thoughts, which are the following. I believe that given the number of countries, in addition to the Netherlands and Germany, that have suspended the use of e-voting, or have lived or gone through crisis when it comes to these systems, we need to carefully assess if we can expose the Mexican democracy to such risks. Experiences also show that the challenges involved in e-voting not only involve technical aspects, but also political aspects. Confidence or crisis of trust can lead to unsustainable crisis when it comes to voting systems. These crises in more consolidated democracies have led to the suspension of e-voting systems. We would need to carefully follow the case of Brazil, where, for example, the army a few days ago requested access to the source code for e-voting machines. In decisions such as that of e-voting, or when it comes to e-voting decisions, we should rely on Max Evans' principles on ethics of responsibility. And I would like to wrap up by quoting Delia Ferreira, the president of International Transparency, or Transparency International, who said the following: modern and rapid seem to be the new democratic values, but still, if we admit that they are, we cannot overlook other priority aspects related to electoral democracy. Modern, rapid, without secrecy of voting is a bad combination. Venezuela and their e-voting systems are a good example of that. Modern and rapid, but not transparent, does not contribute to the legitimacy of elections either. Abandoning e-voting as a result of the resolution of the German court made it clear. Modern and rapid, but without integrity violates standards. And there's unanimity in the sense that professional political audits of a system should be possible. other than rapid, but made a private. It's an attempt against or attack on the legitimacy of electoral principles. Thank you. Dr. Jordi, please. Yes, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for this opportunity and the comment. Let me see. I'll make a reference to the question as to whether these reports that we talked about or audit reports should be made public or not. And based on that, I will make a more general comment, also a link to what other speakers have said. And the response, the simple answer or the easy answers would say yes, or would be yes, everything should be public. That would be the quick and easy answer. But I am sure that this is not the most appropriate answer or the most realistic response, because obviously there are several issues or aspects that are precisely or are not precisely trivial that we need to take into account. When I made reference to arguments in this connection, including those on trade agreements, security, etc., well, that is part of the reality, and we need to take them into account. What I do believe that we need to think about is how we should apply this criteria in the context or within the context of each individual country. I mean, I believe that when these guidelines and principles of a Council of Europe mentioned by Dr. Jorge, we need to take into account the context that we are in. I mean, there is a difference between, for example, a context where citizens distrust electoral authorities traditionally, or where electoral authorities have been involved in suspicious facts, or I mean, that's different from other countries, or another country where electoral authorities, political parties, and citizens have built a mutual trust process. And based on that, the way in which all these reports should be made available or public may vary. I mean, you need everyone, you need all citizens to have access to everything. What we do need is to create this perception of security. In my particular case, for example, receiving audit reports on cryptographic information wouldn't make any sense to me. I can actually apply for it. I mean, but I won't understand anything that these reports say. What I do understand as a citizen is that those who can understand it, all of those who can understand it, should have access to that information, with a numerous and plural group of persons, including observers and political party representatives, who should be able to access those reports, including also an honest and frank debate between electoral authorities and these external observers and auditors. If that is the case, as a citizen, I shouldn't and I wouldn't be interested in having access to those reports. Thank you. And I need to quit now. Thank you, Dr. Barata. Mr. Jorge Torres, yes, as regards security aspects of e-voting machines used in Coahuila and Hidalgo and other states, I would like to mention that precisely what was done with this e-voting was an inspection of these e-voting machines in terms of security, and that was done by the Institute and a third party, which led to adaptations to these e-voting machines so that they would meet the minimum requirements to give certainty to the process. But also we chose e-voting that issued a receipt or proof of voting, which is the litmus test when it comes out to these e-voting systems. If you have this paper proof, you can confirm results against these actual votes. So that's on e-voting machines. Can you vote via SMS or QR codes? That's not possible because the SMS technology is an open technology. and it's an old technology. It's useful, yes, but it's obsolete in this regard. It doesn't have the elements required to guarantee the secrecy and confidentiality of votes. And in the case of QR codes, you have another application or implementation aspects that do not necessarily favor casting votes. When it comes to mobile devices, if we talk about internet processes, and regarding these devices or electronic devices, we will not have all the information we need. I mean, all you need is a telephone number so that we can share with the users data to access the system. But we have privacy policies in the sense that we should not obtain information from mobile devices because these would go against the secrecy of voting and respect for people's rights. As regards audit reservations, I would like to mention that based on standards and regulations on the matter, we conducted an auditing process with the participation of two actors, an academic institution and a private company. And reports are issued on these audits, and these opinions and reports are public to share information about the actual audits. And the source code has certain reservations because of copyright or intellectual property reasons. But it was made available to auditors so that they could verify that the system met the principles of required and standards. In the case of our auditing process, there are preliminary documents that are not precisely the object of public scrutiny. In this case, there was another question as to whether these audits are similar to the PREP, the audits on CBAY, because in the case of a PRP, we would not inspect the source code, because in the case of a PREP, you can audit the information by using or relying on images. In the case of CBAY, we go beyond that because that requires an inspection or a verification of source code and meeting regulatory and procedural matters in addition to good practices when it comes to IT protection. I believe that I answered all the questions. Thank you, engineer. Go ahead, Carlos, please. Well, good morning again. I wanted to focus a little more on the issue of political culture, which is something that we have mentioned several times. And of course, that will be of great help to create that level of transparency, that security or perception of security in the public or voters. In Panama, we have had experience with political parties, which I believe may be similar to other countries. But let me share a small anecdote or a short anecdote. When we initiated or started using e-voting systems, again, as I mentioned, we bought commercially available machines, and we used the 3-in-1 machines, which included touch screen in a single machine, and we removed the keyboard, and we only allowed other use through touch screens. That was back in 2011. The machines that were worth $3,000 each, and at the time it was not very common, but some of them had a webcam similar to the ones we're using today. When we organized the first event involving political parties told the population that these voting machines would take pictures of them, but the tribunal had implemented this webcam system to confirm or to check who they were voting for, and if that would lead to the loss of benefits provided by political parties. And we had to put some tape on these webcams to cover the lenses to give the population the certainty that we're not taking pictures. And we realized that we had to work very close with political parties. We had to address all their questions and doubts, and we had to help them understand the process by involving them in all the processes of auditing tests. We conducted tests with them on several occasions to give them a certainty that we have integrity of data. And as Jorge said, an important aspect was that actual paper proof. And, and all this helps because that allows for the confirmation of the certainty of a process that which leads to the certainty that we need. That's all for now. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Mr. Carlos. Thanks. Go ahead, Mr. Ricardo, please. Thank you, Councillor. When it comes to the case mentioned involving hacking and blockchain, I do not know of any such a situation of hacking in Russia. Even though I looked it up, there was an isolated case of the use of a laptop, apparently, and that is possible. There must be several cases like that, with people attempting to breach the system via laptops. I mean, blockchain is unhackable to date. What could happen is that somebody could steal cryptocurrency from other persons. I mean, you may have blockchain, but if you lose or give somebody else access to your password or your devices, that can happen. But one of the greatest benefits of using digital identity in the case of blockchain is that you are covered twofold. You can protect the voting process through the use of blockchain. And you also protect the identity of citizens because that's also protected by a blockchain system. Today, the best system is the one used by in Mexico. That could be, however, the starting point for the implementation of a blockchain, because that would allow us to handle these or deal with these cases. And again, as some other people have said, there is no perfect system. Even paper systems or paper-based systems are hackable or are vulnerable because people at polling stations or polling station officers can steal ballots. Or if somebody's sick and they cannot vote because it's raining. I mean, that's a limitation. I mean, the benefits of electronic systems are uncommensurable compared to others. Yes, they have to improve. They still have to improve. They are not 100% safe. And just like the web page of the Ministry of Finance was hacked, didn't lead to the decision to stop using web pages. You just have to implement the right protections and improve things. That's my vision. Thank you. Thank you, Ricardo. Well, this is the end of the session. And let me close with three basic ideas based on success stories and failures. Because I understand that we need to conduct a review of things so far, including success and failures. We need to identify solutions for the present based on past success and failure. That has led to the development of security standards and regulations that we implement that in it, including also operational standards to mitigate risks, even though it's not possible to have a perfect model or 100% safe model anywhere in the world. And especially when it comes to technologies, we do have mechanisms in place to provide security and guarantee the benefits and the characteristics required for voting and the right characteristics for elections. When it comes to protecting votes, we must be transparent and open to the extent possible, as long as we do not jeopardize the operation of the system itself. We also need to take a look at confidentiality clauses in systems given the transparency needs that must exist. And of course, we should also have continuity and contingency plans as well as verification plans in any model. I want to thank each and all of you for following us, especially to those participating as speakers. I'm pleased to have had an opportunity to listen to you and having had access to your arguments and reflections. And of course, we'll stay put to continue to move forward by building the trust that we need. I'm also convinced about the need to implement technologies when it comes to voting processes and elections, and we will continue to be careful on that because as an authority, as authorities, that's our responsibility. Have a great day. Thanks a lot.
Gracias por seguir esta transmisión.
Thank you for being present on this broadcast, possibilities and challenges for the implementation of e-voting in Mexico. Next, we will open the panel on implementation of e-voting systems with the moderation of the electoral counselor of INE, Tania Paula Rabel Cuevas, to whom we want to welcome. Thanks a lot. Good afternoon to everyone. I want to welcome each and all of you to this third session of a forum, Electronic Voting Possibilities and Challenges for its implementation in Mexico, which was born out of two practical considerations. Number one, given the significant achievements in electoral processes and e-voting systems and electronic systems as a result of a pandemic, which made us rethink many of the principles and the practices we had in place, and also considering the possibilities of democracy, especially because we have reform movement in Mexico, and e-voting has come to the limelight in this debate. Similar to any other reforms, there is a need for reflection, which has to do with the constitutional engineering, which, paraphrasing Sartori, is the mechanics and the design outlining the operation or non-operation of the institutional machinery, especially in terms of efficacy and reliability. In other words, to be able to implement something as ambitious as e-voting system, we need to have highly robust legislation that is also broadly discussed, subject to consensus and approved with a significant political agreement. E-voting as such, and as we know, can be in person or remote through the use of e-voting machines, for example, that may be connected or not to the network or over the internet. In Mexico, both experiences are known and have been tested with a lot of caution, especially because for more than 30 years, we have increased the level of trust in our elections, which means that INE has a high approval ratings among citizens above 70%. It's important to mention for purpose of this panel that whereas in the case of internet voting, there are legal provisions, including those in the law on electoral procedures. In the case of e-voting, we have made progress thanks to the validation of jurisdictional bodies. However, when it comes to this matter, we cannot lose sight of the fact that there are ulterior issues that have to do, for example, with aspects such as civic education, digital literacy, a generation of trust, and costs, especially. For example, we organized a bidding for e-voting machines where the unit price of each machine went up from 73,000 and 209,000 pesos. In the federal election alone, we installed more than 162,000 polling stations. Considering the lowest cost for e-voting machines, we would have needed more than 11 billion pesos only for this implementation. This is an overview to give evidence of the situation of e-voting in Mexico, and this panel is fundamental to delve deeper into the matter and learn about the opinion of four voices authorized to share their reflections on this topic, which is so relevant. So I want to welcome you on behalf of the National Electoral Institute. I want to welcome the experts and guests who will have time as much as 15 minutes each to share their reflections. We begin with Dr. Alejandra Lázara, who comes from the Supreme Court of the nation of Argentina. And next we would have Cesar Astudillo, a researcher from the National Autonomous University of Mexico. And then we'll have Dr. Nicolas Farfan, Delegate Registrar for Electoral Matters in the Civil body of Colombia. And then we'll close with Graciela Sanchez, who is the chair of a commission on electoral political reform of the Chamber of Deputies in Mexico. I understand that we had a change, and she's on behalf of Dr. Farfan, who is an advisor on electoral matters in Colombia, Dr. Carlos Leiva. Thanks a lot to each and all of you for your presence, and I'll give the floor to Dr. Alejandra Lázaro. Go ahead, please. Well, to begin with, I would like to thank the National Electoral Institute for this invitation to participate and the possibility of engaging in this debate where we need to also rethink in our particular case what we are doing. And I'll share during my presentation what the situation in our country is and our experiences when it comes to different subnational electoral events. So I want to express my gratitude for this invitation. And the reality is that, as Tanya said, the inclusion or the adoption of new technologies in the electoral process is a phenomenon that has been taking shape and gaining more momentum. And in addition, everything that has to do with the application of technologies in different processes as a result of the pandemic we have lived has made us become more virtual. And I believe that we're all aware of the need to adopt and incorporate technology further. If we talk about the electoral process in itself, we know that all throughout the stages of this process, this concatenation of different phases involved and required by electoral process, well, that requires an in-depth and critical study for the modernization of electoral processes. But I believe that there are two moments in particular that are highly sensitive. Not, one is not more important than the other, but I believe, because I believe that all the different aspects are equally important, but they are mutually dependent so that we can make processes efficient and effective, especially considering the social sensitivity related to them. One of them is the act of voting in itself, casting our vote, the moment of casting our votes. And the other has to do with scrutiny or tallying of votes, either preliminary or final. And that raises issues related to sensitivity among citizens and political parties. It would seem like you're pointing directly to the heart of the democratic system. Something also important to mention is that when we talk about e-voting, or at least in my case, when I'm talking about e-voting, I'm making a broad reference to the act of voting through different devices that today can range from a computer to e-voting machines to optical scanners and even cell phones. With a simple use of a cell phone, we could be casting our votes. And while this is not something novel, because the truth is that all this process of experimentation has been going on for 25 years approximately around e-voting and the use and adoption of technologies into electoral processes. The reality is that legislation applicable by each country, as well as the results achieved in each of them, vary significantly. So, yes, we may be able to develop some guidelines based on experiences we have found. But I still do believe that we need to continue to analyze some aspects so that we can correct errors and failures and fill in some gaps. But there is a core aspect that all legislation should include, because no matter what the voting instrument or tool you use or adopt, you must always guarantee the secrecy of voting, as well as transparency, control, and the auditability of the system involved. Let me move away from I won't mention training, even though it is also important for the success of this voting system. We need proper training, not only training for citizens, but also for prosecutors, for polling station officers, and all of those involved or in participating in this process. And for this reason, I believe that when it comes to e-voting, especially, you often find that there are two major groups: those who strongly and radically oppose the implementation of e-voting systems, and those who defend it with the strong faith, without possibly being specific or delving into the study of specific aspects that require analysis and study. And I also believe that, in particular, these aspects should be subject to the analysis of those in charge of implementing an electoral reform like the ones we're talking about. So, I mean, beyond any questions or statements on the voting system, the question or the main question to respond is this: the adoption or incorporation of technologies is being done under a controllable environment or not? Because if that's the basis we consider for the process, we can move forward. Otherwise, we would be left stuck in the first stage and we would be unable to move forward. When it comes to control, I believe that this is also closely related to everything having to do with publicity. And in this regard, I believe that's important to point out uh, what several years ago was expressed or stated in 2009 by the German Federal Court. At the time, it was said that the Federal German Court had declared the e-voting unconstitutional. They had declared the constitutionality of the e-voting system implemented in that country, but that was not the case. The German court made a ruling, and that ruling had to do with some regulatory aspects that had to do with the power of electoral policing and the implementation or execution of this procedure, because precisely the court understood that this would affect some constitutional guarantees or rights, like the principle of publicity of elections, which states that all the essential phases involved in the voting process should be subject to public control. And but there are other constitutional interests that could justify that is not the case. But the court mainly said that all citizens who do not have specific or specialized knowledge should be able to control all the different aspects of electoral events or acts and the result of those electoral events or acts. Otherwise, we would be weakening, they said, the public nature or character of elections. So, as I mentioned earlier, it is rather obvious that losing the legitimacy of the system couldn't be done at the expense of an alleged increased efficacy as a result of the adoption of technologies. However, that doesn't mean either that the ruling was against e-voting machines, but rather against procedures that, in the opinion of the tribunal, did not respect of these basic and constitutional principles.
And I also think it's very important to mention it again, because just like Maria Stulin mentions in an article that she published some years back regarding on democracy and technology, it's not inserted into a vacuum. To the contrary, it's inserted into a complex web that is political, social, and electoral. So we must take into account all of this web, all of this diversity of situations and regulations when being implemented. I'm going to share the experience that we had in Argentina. And we should highlight that the voting instrument in my country for national elections is the paper ballot. You have a list of candidates for each political party. These are presented. And this system of paper ballots is the one used in subnational districts, with the exception of two provinces, Córdoba and Santa Fe. They have adopted a unique paper ballot instead of having a variety of ballots per political parties, where they can't even catch up with the amount of ballots that they have. These two provinces have adopted each with their differences, a system of unique ballot paper ballot. In 2016, with Macri, the executive power sent to the Congress an approval to modify the voting instrument. And with this, they incorporate e-voting for general elections. The truth is that the project did not go forward, and it is true that this bill did not only cause a lot of debate, but when they talked about controls that this system had to be implemented were not clear. In fact, in the Congress, it took 2 months and then it was like slightly sanctioned, but it was approved. But when it goes to the Senate, it did not go forward because the objections were important. And especially there were many questions. And it's not a topic that we can just leave open on the table. You can't have open questions. If we always say that e-voting has to be completely clear and assessed, not only the experience, but also risks and possibilities, and jump ahead of what could happen, well, if you have a system that has all these open questions, well, it couldn't go forward. In fact, well, now there is a debate nationally to incorporate just this unique paper ballot. And of course, it has its pros and cons, like any voting instrument or any element of the electoral system. However, it is true that to the extent that technology goes forward and that systems become more complex, sometimes to offer more freedom and possibilities to the voters to vote, well, the unique paper ballot also represents a difficulty. It's a system that's rooted in Latin America. But just to share an example, in Paraguay, in the most recent elections, when they have a closed list system, but with the possibility of adding to the list plus a system of proportional representation, it became much more complex. And it was resolved through e-voting, and it turned out to be a very successful case. Going back to Argentina, we have experiences since 2013, but I would say that these are subnational. It occurs in municipal positions in different departments, some provinces, but the great majority take place at a department level. Some were binding and some were non-binding. So if we scan these experiences, we will see common aspects as well as differences. For example, who was the entity in charge of the logistics? In some cases, you had national companies, in others, international companies, and in other cases, the public bodies themselves were doing it. What we do observe is that since 2003 to 2010, the legislation was very poor. All regulations were limited. And after 2010, they began to incorporate more controls as well as the possibility of further oversight and following some international standards. Just as an example, in Buenos Aires in 2015, with the approval of a law of 2013, 4894, which was regulated by means of a decree and also through the Court of Enforcement, which was the higher justice court that regulates the whole procedure. It is established to have a control system of what was called this unique paper ballot. And this unique paper ballot went through a whole process and it contained an auditability of contents, for example, of the DVD where you could include parallel tests before, during, and after. I am out of time, but I must state that the most successful experience that our country has had is in Salta. The Salta process began in 2008, and this is the province that had an election for the executive power that was done totally electronically. Oh, I'm sorry, through the unique paper ballot. And one of the most important strengths that this system has is that it has the backup of the paper ballot. So this paper also has a chip that can be verified with the scanning machine to ensure that what is printed on the ballot is what that person voted for. So we have been able to evolve, and the province has been able to regulate and legislate it. In 2017, they're going to have their third law, and it has to do with its implementation and application. And this has been done through the electoral court of the province. They have had many obstacles, but it offers the full freedom of this system through easy elections offered to the citizens. So this is concluded with many issues of the paper ballot issues like not having enough, breaking the chain of custody or whatever. But there are three main areas that should be highlighted. Any legislation must take into account the secrecy of vote, more freedom for citizens, meaning all the judicial scaffolding to protect the votes of citizens, the legitimacy and purity of this vote, and also for the political party activities, allow them participate in the hearings where we begin with the verification of contents of any voting machine, control them during the process, at the end of the process, and perform all types of audits, and also the possibility of other bodies to participate, such as universities that are authorities that are neutral and independent. And it allows them through their contributions and verifications and control to be much more legitimate and secure for all the stakeholders in elections. Well, that's it. So in the Q&A session, I will be glad to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much, Alejandra Lázaro. Thank you for sharing your experience in Argentina. You have mentioned that e-voting is not something new. You've been working on electronic vote for 25 years in the world. I would say that those countries that have implemented e-voting, the experiences of India, Brazil, Bulgaria, and Venezuela, or some states in the US are quite relevant. Maybe we should be focusing on those Latin American countries that have used e-voting because we have similarities, socially speaking, in Mexico. In Mexico, we are discussing the possibility of an electoral reform. And something that is very interesting to me regarding the reform initiatives that have been presented is that the three main political forces of the country talk about e-voting as a way of voting that has to take place now. In these initiatives, they talk about two aspects. One, taking advantage of technologies for further citizen participation and cost saving for the Mexican state. And I think that we have to answer the question in this forum if the use of e-voting truly can attend to these two purposes. When we talk about cost saving and also referring to what was being said at the beginning, in electronic ballot boxes, we have seen that the average price of an electronic ballot box is around 50,000 pesos. However, this year we did a bidding process in INE and the prices went between 7,200 and 100,000 pesos approximately. So if we have to multiply the polling stations times the 70,000 pesos, we would have to invest 11.9 million pesos. This is a higher budget than the base budget that INE has for the whole year of 2022. So based on this, we can see that we have an approximate cost of electronic ballot boxes without VAT that would also not consider transportation, storing, training, and audits that are also costly. The polling stations don't only have documentation because we have to consider equipment of the polling stations like leasing furniture, bathrooms, etc., as well as the measures to guarantee accessibility like ramps and signage. So I don't think that we can confirm that e-voting with electronic ballot boxes will automatically represent a reduction in costs. Now I am going to give the floor to our next speaker, who is Cesar Asturillo. Thank you very much, Counselor. I am very happy to be here in this panel. I want to say thank you to INE. I want to say thank you to Counselor Humphrey and Ravel for inviting me, as well as your work as a moderator. I think that what we are reflecting on is something very pertinent. I'm going to share some aspects that have to do with me not working so directly in electoral matters. It allows me to have more of a general perspective. So if I make a mistake in any of my statements, I please apologize because I'm a little disconnected now. We see that Mexico is getting towards modernity. We are, with no doubt, and this has been recognized nationally and internationally, the best in elections. However, we have been running behind because we do not use innovations, just like our Councillor Ravel mentioned. We have Estonia, France, the Netherlands, as well as some states in the US, Canada, Spain, Switzerland, Austria, and India, and among us, we have Brazil, Costa Rica, and Venezuela. They have done so much more than we have. Taking an advantage that we have Ms. Lázaro with us, I would say that it's as if Mexico were the best in traditional winemaking, where our grapes get their nectar through horses, whereas in other places we see that Germany and Argentina are using processes that are based on technology that allow them to obtain wine that is almost of the same quality of Mexico. Of course, this can be discussed, but it makes the wine cheaper, and that way it can reach many more people. So following this line of thought, we cannot just be anchored in the past. basically what is holding back our work is a legislation. We have the technical capacity, we have the knowledge. What's holding us back and what has been holding us back since 1990 is a legislation. And precisely, it's a legislation that does not allow us to take steps forward. So we have to focus on removing obstacles that, in a perspective of our legislation, does not allow us to go forward. So we must work on this. I think that we should also talk about the premise of humanity into a digital era and how this has boosted our activities and made it easier. With the pandemic, well, the fact that we were at home and that we couldn't go to our classrooms or restaurants, or that we were not able to go out and do shopping or going to the bank, very quickly taught us that banks came to our home, restaurants came to our home, banking services came to our house, education came to our house. And we were sitting in our home in front of a computer. And this way we had access to a whole group of possibilities that we have still not been able to access in electoral matters. Right now, digital resources are used for public services, education, banking services, and safety. So now I think we have to go forward and talk about digital rights as well as digital elections. We have been able to have progress for people who historically were excluded and now they can participate in democracy. We can see what has happened with the participation of women, elderly, handicapped people, Mexicans abroad. However, we are going very slowly in the access to digital technology and to make it easier to vote. Historically speaking, just like we have a historical cycle of like 25 years where e-voting has gone forward, in our country in 2024, we are going to have our first 20 years of the first attempt with a collaboration of IFE and the electoral state of Coahuila to implement e-voting. And the state of Coahuila, I think, is the state that has had the most progress in the implementation of these e-ballot boxes. We're talking about 20 years now. If we want to analyze the obstacles that have not allowed us to leave this tradition, I want to talk about 5. First of all, we have the historical aspect, which is the lack of trust. I think that in the previous tables, you have talked about our lack of trust that we think is part of our DNA of Mexicans, and it's obviously taken to our political arena. And distrust is everywhere. So when we talk about internet, those who do not trust always say that these systems have zero reliability. I think very few things in the world have absolute reliability. So I don't think that we can say that we can't go to e-voting because it can fail. It's like saying that our tax system does not fail. It does fail. The CONACYT system doesn't fail. Yes, it does fail. And I have personally experienced this because I have issues with this where the tax platform is not allowing me to go forward. Okay, so I just want to underline one point here. The key point is to ask ourselves, and I take a step back from what Ms. Lazaro stated. I understand that everything has to be regulated, but I want to pay attention to who should regulate. I think that that's the key question to be asked. what should be regulated, who should regulate it, and how should we regulate it, and under which modality. That's what I'm going to talk about in just a minute. Then we have the political aspects. The political aspects have two arenas. The institutional part of it, that is holding back electoral authorities because of a certain fear that to the extent that we can go forward with something and eventually that it could fail, it could cause a political, personal, institutional responsibility. So instead of going forward, we take steps backwards and we begin to ask ourselves if it's a good idea or not. But I also think that the other political arena has to do with the political parties. Of course, political parties are controversial with the implementation of e-voting because it affects their capacity of mobilization on the day of the elections. It affects the use of programs of the vote. And this is like a sport.
Medallas de oro y plata en... Y el otro, del que casi no se habla, a ver si me están escuchando.
And the other thing is that we lost your voice for a few seconds. Okay, we're back again. The other factor that we do not talk about is the economic factor. Why do we have a Baroque legislation that does not allow us to go forward? What we have to ask ourselves is, who has it benefited to have our elections based on handing in papers where you have to have all this documentation with security, with ballots that have all these filters of security and that increase the cost of our elections greatly? So I think that the answer here has to be seen according to the past and present. In its past times, it was a benefit to politicians and it created business environments where a few companies are the ones who, elections after elections, are earning tons of money. All they do is work for the elections. So this would entail that we have to throw down this traditional model and it would affect economies and interests of political classes and business classes. So now I'm going to focus on the judicial aspects and I'm going to share some background. The judicial aspect is who should regulate, how much should they regulate, and under which modality. I think we have to see the background because in 2009, the court said something very interesting. They said that the use of electronic ballot boxes was a modality that does have legal coverage and that it does not violate the principles of elections that are constitutionally stated, nor the characteristics of voting that are also constitutionally presented. This was stated by the court. And in 2020, just recently, it was stated that due to the national condition of INE, they had to issue guidelines and rules to facilitate voting based on electronic ballot boxes. And as a consequence, and this is very interesting, it can be debatable, but it's part of our topic of discussion. The parliaments of the federal entities have no powers to regulate the implementation of the electronic ballot box. I would take a step back, and I just presented as part of our background. Then the Electoral Court has also consistently recognized throughout many years that the implementation of electronic voting is based on regulatory activities that electoral authorities do have currently. And recently, with the pilot program in Jalisco and Coahuila, it was also stated, even though I must say this was 4 in favor and 3 against, that INE does have the possibility to issue guidelines for e-voting, even though I would focus on private votes, where 3 justices stated that to do so, we do need a constitutional backup that does not exist today. As a consequence, I'm going to answer some questions in the few minutes I have left. How to legislate? We have to go towards a maximalist legislation based on what we have built, where we have an overregulated legislation, or be minimalistic. I'm talking about my legislation. I'm talking about something that the Congress has to deal with. I think it should be minimalistic with the minimum, with the essential basis. And as a consequence, if you ask me who should regulate this activity of e-voting, I have no doubt in answering that the electoral authorities should be the ones. The 33, the INE, which should establish guidelines for the federal elections, and as a national authority to issue the basic rules of the implementation of these voting systems in federal entities. And then based on these guidelines that each electoral state system has, will do what they have to do. It's similar to the guiding capacity for its regulatory authority, like with PREP. Number 2, now that the electoral court has recognized that INE does have the power to regulate the use of technologies to favor and maximize voting, for me, it's very important to reinforce the power of INE with very specific powers. And these should be stated in the law. With 2 lines, I think it could be included. What for? So that they can have explicit powers to implement e-voting inside of Mexico. We were talking about Mexicans voting abroad. Yes, there is a regulation for this, but here in Mexico, we have to take it to a national context in federal and local elections. Then we have to go into a category that the Germans have approached with the regulatory autonomy, or a procedure of the autonomous bodies. And in this line of thought, we must make a distinction that in the regulations, it's no longer coming from making the law concrete like we have in our country, but that it comes from constitutional powers that the INE already has. So the court has recognized that they have different regulations with telecommunications, which is another autonomous body that can regulate telecommunications. And also it has been done by the higher court and JDC 10257 2020. I am concluding now, and I'm going to conclude with the following. We do not need to reinforce the Constitution. Here we have the principles of elections, of voting. There are clearly some other principles that can reinforce e-voting, but these can clearly be stated in the law. And if you are considering reforming the law, you have to explicitly talk about the 2 ways of voting: electronic ballot box voting and internet voting, because they are 2 different aspects. What we would have to ask ourselves is, where is INE going to regulate this? In a specific regulation on voting or e-voting or guidelines? There are differences in each one of the categories, and I have no more time to go into these. But based on this, and now I will conclude, INE could determine, once we have this regulation, to determine case per case in each election in which type of elections to use e-voting. And here we have to be very specific. Here I want to talk about internet coverage. I apologize. I know I'm taking up a little more time, but this is very important because it comes from the census of 2020 and data of IFT 22. Of the 189,000 approximate candidates, where we have a great majority of our Mexicans. In 2018, we had 93,000 with connectivity, 93, less than 50%. But for 2023, they think that they will reach 126,000 out of 189,000. As a consequence, we cannot make a decision by saying, okay, now we're all going to do e-voting in all of Mexico, because we still are lacking the essential aspects, but the electoral authority has to determine it on a case per case way. And we have to also talk about mixed options or just e-ballot boxes or internet voting. So this would also have to be done with the financial aspects. How much are the e-ballot boxes? How much is internet voting costing, etc.? Is it worthwhile to reinforce the principles, just like Ms. Lázaro talked about transparency of results, security, and verifiability? I also was going to talk about the ruling of 2009 of Germany, but just like Ms. Lázaro said, we have to focus on it being verifiable, and we also have to take this responsibility on. Thank you very much. I conclude.
Thanks to you, Dr. Astudillo. Thank you for your participation. You opened by saying that Mexico was caught in the tradition. And I was thinking that we often like to do things in an artisanal way. There are areas where this is highly appreciated, but there are other areas where we need to continue to move forward when it comes to the use of technologies to make our processes more efficient. And that's a case, in my opinion, of electoral matters. It's important to make progress and transition into e-voting, but with good knowledge about its operation and implementation, not under false premises in terms of savings that may not be achievable. In your participation, you also talked about the success story of the electoral public body of Coahuila. And I believe that along those lines, we could work to explore the possibility of manufacturing ballot boxes with our own resources or the resources of electoral authorities, and that would reduce costs. Maybe one initial step would require analyzing the status of ballot boxes nationwide, which we have done already. Electoral bodies in the states have more than 1,000 e-ballot boxes, 744 of which are functional. The National Electoral Institute has 1,100 functional e-ballot boxes, Model 4.0 distributed in the 300 district boards of 10 e-voting machines, 5.1 and 2 e-ballot boxes, prototype 6.0 in central offices or headquarters. Together, that amounts to 1,856 ballot boxes that are functional nationwide. I emphasize the models because it is necessary for the operating systems of these ballot boxes to be similar so that they can operate as a network in the same election. In that regard, we not have a sufficient number of ballot boxes to use in the polling stations that we open in elections. And even those available cannot work simultaneously because they have different operating systems. Talking about the regulation, which has to do with this panel, in Mexico, as mentioned by Dr. Astudillo, we do not have regulation to transition into the emission and the receipt of votes electronically nationwide, neither through e-ballot boxes or e-voting or internet voting, excuse me. We do have a resolution related to an appeal where the higher court said that there is no constitutional reason to affirm that given the absence of a law, it is not feasible for the institute to issue general regulations in this regard, as long as they are issued for the use or for the application of regulations in their sphere of competence, because the institute has the power to implement the guidelines to enforce the different constitutional principles. And with this, that validated the decision of INE of using e-ballot boxes in some polling stations. Now, statewide or the state level, it is worth noting that in those states where legislation has been issued to regulate the use of e-ballot boxes, the Superior Court of a nation has consistently validated its use. In the action of inconstitutionally 5109, the court decided that the use of e-voting doesn't mean that voting could or would be excluded from the principles of suffrage as long as the vote is free, direct, and secret. This is something that Alejandra Lázaro emphasized. That resolution led to jurisprudence 29/2010 that states that local laws and constitutions will guarantee or shall guarantee that the elections take place under the principle of a direct, secret, and direct suffrage, and that the guidelines should be those of impartiality, independence, subjectivity, but that doesn't include a mandate, a specific mandate on the use or the implementation of suffrage. And under that lens, the regulation to use voting machines doesn't mean that that would jeopardize the characteristics necessary for the casting of votes or the principles involved. That was part of the law on the electoral procedural law of Yucatan that provided for the use of e-ballot boxes. And next, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Leiva. Carlos Leiva, go ahead, please. Well, Counselor, thanks a lot. I would like to say hi to my colleagues here in the panel, as well as all the participants listening to us today. And thank you to for giving me an opportunity to participate in this important forum, which is related to current electoral legislation in a comparative fashion, and specifically talking about e-voting in Colombia. And I would like to say hi on behalf of Dr. Nicolas Farfan from the National Civil Register of Colombia. We do believe that in this panel, several essential issues have been addressed. Number one, the implementation that technologies, the adoption of technologies in electoral processes must fulfill or meet a series of requirements without which its implementation could lead to failure. That has to do mainly with security aspects. What you said about the verifiability or traceability of information, as well as secrecy of votes. And in addition to that, the level of trust or credibility when it comes to technologies for the implementation of e-voting. So that political organizations, political parties in the countries and citizens in the different countries can understand the implementation of these electronic systems. Um, guaranteeing the good use of information, which is similar to what we require in manual voting processes. To the point, for example, that in Colombia, we have implemented a series of measures. Many of you have been here as observers in electoral processes, recent electoral processes. And we need to rely on the fact that we have an electoral code that is obsolete. Our electoral code dates back to 1986. And we're talking about an electoral code that when it comes to the implementation of technologies is outdated because it talks about technological advancements available in 1986. That doesn't mean that we do not have legislation that allows for the use of technologies or e-voting systems during the stages of electoral processes. We, ever since we had a constitutional assembly, because our constitution, the most recent, was legislated in 1986. Well, that process led to a series of provisions that updated our law of 1986. That was in 1991. With these constitutional changes and some other constitutional amendments to the political constitution of 91, mainly that resulting from legislation that modified Article 58 of our constitution that speaks about voting tools or instruments that established the possibility of implementing e-voting to make voting more agile and effective. That was back in 2003, because we need to take into account that this debate that you have mentioned earlier, as some of the presenters have mentioned earlier, E-voting is not novel. We have been talking about this topic for more than 25 years, and it's included in our constitution since 2003. After 2003, the Congress of the Republic has also issued a series of provisions and changes that respond to our aspiration to have more effective e-voting processes. Since 2004, we have had jurisprudence that legislates that all provisions having to do with the participation of political parties and citizens in voting processes and rights related to political participation as a core principle should be part of statutory laws. That is, laws that require a legislative procedure that is more strict and lengthier process before they can be approved legislatively. Since 2004, therefore, we had this legislation that allowed us to replace paperwork or physical paper processes with electronic means. Electors or voters should have access to biometric devices that would confirm their identity so that they all the different political parties and their candidates could participate on an equal basis in these e-ballot boxes with a specific method of recognizing the identity of voters with the difference of interfaces and communication with the central headquarters to confirm their identity and that information. My point is that since 2004, we have had legislation and legal provisions for the implementation of these mechanisms. As a matter of fact, in 2004, they provided for a term of no more than 5 years counted as of 2004 to start pilot testing of voting with these new systems. Clearly, at the time, as today, they thought that we should still have a coexistence between conventional manual voting systems and electronic voting systems, always taking into account the technological infrastructure available in certain polling stations, connectivity aspects, because as you know, the Colombian territory has a diversity, a broad diversity when it comes to its orography. We have different conditions all throughout the country where connectivity problems could lead to delays or challenges when it comes to the automation of voting systems. And here I want to focus on voting systems and not other phases of the system, including biometric identification of voters. And as this legislation move forward, we continue to see the legislation of a series of reforms, especially in 2008, that established, for example, that on election days, and when it came to the implementation of e-voting, these processes had to respond to the availability of infrastructure and conditions in polling stations, including schools, which we use a lot in the Colombian territory. After that, in 2011, we had a significant reform on the electoral system and the system that regulates the participation of political parties in Colombia, which is part of Law 1475 of 2011. This law addressed the possibility of e-voting again to agilize elections and make them more transparent, establishing that the e-voting systems should involve several components. Again, identification of voters with an ID, with a current ID, or through the use of technological means or biometric authentication systems. As many of you know, and for those who don't know, in Colombia, we have been making progress hand in hand, and not only with electoral processes, but also in terms of citizen identification, because identifying citizens or confirming their identity is an essential element that has an intrinsic relationship with the exercise of political participation. Right now, we have made progress in, for example, the case of electronic IDs for citizens with biometric components. If we can combine these aspects of citizen identification with electoral processes, that means that we will have robust systems that will facilitate the identification of voters in an efficient manner. Now, speaking about e-voting specifically, the law establishes progressiveness where the National Civil Registry for Electoral Matters can guarantee or should guarantee um, the progress in the adoption of these technologies together with the considerations regarding the political, social, and cultural context of the country so that citizens can have the certainty that we can guarantee that traceability by increasing their trust in the implementation of these electronic voting systems. Back in 2011, the legislators also established a term, a deadline, which was 2014 for the implementation of these projects. We have had a pilot project that we have been conducting since 2013, where the political constitution established the possibility of implementing e-voting. And all the way to 2014, we implemented a series of pilot tests, which were not binding, even though they have been scarce. What happens? We created an advisory commission for the implementation and adoption of these information technologies. However, uh, we have lacked the political will. And I also would like to go back to the point touched upon by Dr. Dani. I'm talking about the costs of implementing these systems. I mean, we recognize that in order to implement the adoption of these technologies, we need to update our regulations and laws, which may be archaic or obsolete. In other words, we need legislation. And in this, I agree with Dr. Estudillo, a minimalist legislation so that we're not caught with a specific voting modality. That regulatory body should help us so that the adoption of technologies and the advancements of technologies do not leave us stuck with a specific modality of voting, because we know that technological advancements move faster than regulatory aspects or legislation. So the idea is for these legislative changes to enable electoral bodies to have some margin of maneuver for the implementation of the adoption of technologies for voting processes. And also, I want to mention that in 2020, you may know about it, under the leadership of the National Register of the Civil Registry for Electoral Matters, in working together with the Electoral Authority and the Council of State in Colombia, which is the leader when it comes to administrative contentious matters. They have a specific department dealing with electoral matters and the control of administrative acts carried out by electoral authorities. And so together with all these authorities and the support of the exiting government administration, because as many of you know, we just elected a new government. So together with them, we submitted a new bill for change to change the electoral code, because we had a series of aspects that were scattered. And so we needed the legislation that condensed all these guidelines so that we could move forward in the implementation of technologies when it comes to electoral processes. That bill was submitted to the Congress of the Republic. And here I would like to make a pause, because we have also said that it's essential to have consensus when it comes to political parties and the different stakeholders affected by electoral laws. We submitted this bill, and the Congress of the Republic in consensus came up with a new law that included a series of mechanisms for the implementation of technologically assisted systems in electoral processes. So this law was approved by the Congress of the Republic, and as I mentioned, in Colombia, that still has to be approved by the Constitutional Tribunal, which declared it unviable. but only for failures in the administrative processes involved, because this was amid the pandemic, and I mean, many of the discussions took place virtually, and there was a problem when it came to legislative procedures in the virtual sphere, because it fell outside of the periods established by the chamber. So the Superior Court didn't invalidate the law, but the registrar, with the support of the national government, which um, was part of the opposition of the last government, to give you a context. And that opposition was highly interested in the implementation of new technologies in e-voting systems, guaranteeing security, traceability, credibility, data integrity, but especially that same bill included a broad audit system with a technical data functionality audits where political parties and citizens could verify the consistency of votes against results with traceability or verifiability of votes. That's the reason why we resubmitted this bill that was done last week with a commission that the legislator appointed. And we came back with the same bill that we had submitted back in 2020. Now, we implemented this process, and the consensus in Congress was that we will have mixed voting modalities and a progressive transition process that must be combined with manual voting. The e-voting process or system approved by Congress in Colombia is a mixed system, which by definition is the one that allows voters to cast their vote through the use of technologies so that there is a consistency in voting. These e-voting machines cannot be connected to public networks. This out of fear of hacking and the possibility of messing with the electoral truth in this technological transition. In addition to that, the law requires a physical proof of voting that will be deposited in ballot boxes. So if there is a difference between the count of these e-voting machines, you can match them against the physical proof of voting. All of these because these e-voting systems should guarantee tranquility among political parties or political forces as part of this gradual and progressive transition towards e-voting. So we used the mixed system. So along the lines of what Dr. Astudillo said, we also made it possible for voting instruments followed a series of guidelines. I'm running out of time. Let me finish this idea and I'll wrap up. I mean, that implementation of mixed voting is a given modality. However, the registry for civil matters has the power so that as technologies continue to evolve and making new conquests, we do not get caught with obsolete technologies or technologies that will end up becoming obsolete given the progress of technological means. So to wrap up, let me tell you that in Colombia, we're moving forward in this area in terms of updating the law and regulations, but we want to make sure that we can guarantee the secrecy and the level of trust and credibility of votings. There is a consensus among political forces in Colombia in terms of advancing in this field, the field of e-voting. And in recent electoral events, we realized how difficult it is to vote manually in this period. And we thought about, we continue to think about what we need to do to continue to advance electoral processes in the 21st century. I want to thank you for the opportunity to share our experience, and I'm open to any question. Thank you, Councillor, and thank you to my fellow panelists. Thank you, Dr. Leiva. Thank you for sharing the Colombian experience, and upon listening to your presentation, I realized that we have many similarities. You talked about the fact that the Colombian Electoral Code dated back to 1986, and then your constitution was amended in 1991. And that's where you provided for the possibility of e-voting. You have not updated the electoral code, which reminds me of several situations that we have experienced in the Mexican electoral sphere, where more than once the Constitution has established rights for citizens that are not reflected in specific laws. In the case of INE, that has forced us to develop guidelines, regulations in order to fulfill these rights within the context of elections. I would also like to share information as to the status of internet voting in Mexico to give all the audience context, especially those that are following the topic of our interest today. Internet voting is only possible for Mexicans residing abroad, as I mentioned earlier. This dates back to the reform of 2014 with Article 13 of the General Law of Electoral Procedures. In addition, Article 229 of LHIP establishes that this law would be subject to our guidelines, which should guarantee certainty and for Mexicans residing abroad for the effective exercise of their right to vote in popular elections. Article 343 of LEGIPE also establishes that the e-voting system or any e-voting system should be auditable in any of the stages of its implementation and development by giving voters the possibility of confirming their vote before it's cast, avoid a coercion of votes by guaranteeing a secret suffrage, by guaranteeing that whoever casts the vote is the person entitled to do it, as well as ensuring that Mexicans residing abroad cannot cast more than one vote electronically or any other modality under the law, and have an electoral results program that is in real time, that is also public and reliable. And finally, that the INE should establish guidelines to protect the security of votes. In 2019, the first guidelines were released for e-voting, internet voting, excuse me, that established the main characteristics of the system. Internet voting began its operation for electoral elections in 2020 and 2021. It was also used in electoral processes in 2021 and 2022, as well as recall. So it has been used in 14 elections over the period of 13 years. Last May 9, the General Council of India approved the guidelines for internet voting for Mexicans residing abroad, which are permanent, and they are materialized in Annex 21.2 of election results and regulations. That is, we have already included it in our elections election regulations. Next, we have Dr. Sanchez Ortiz. Go ahead, Mrs. Sanchez Ortiz. Well, good afternoon. I want to cordially greet you. And I want to say that all the previous participations have been interesting, including that by Dr. Lázaro, Dr. Astudillo, and Dr. Leiva. And I want to express my gratitude for the invitation extended to me through Councillor Astrid. Why? Because that gave us an opportunity to participate here. And I also want to thank the moderator of this interesting session, Daniela Paula. Having said that, having said this, let me share my screen to do my presentation on this topic.
Un momentito, por favor.
Just a second, please.
Diputada, si requiere que le apoyemos desde acá, con
If you
gusto
need
nos-
additional support and you cannot share your presentation, why don't you just email us your presentation so that we can share our screen from here? Can you send it to us by email? Yes, let me just email it to you. In the meantime, I can make a few comments on this important topic of discussion, which we are also studying here at the Chamber of Deputies, which is a bill submitted by the President of the Republic. In addition to going over some initiatives or bills as proposed by several parliamentary groups during your introduction, you were right. It's not a single proposal. We can see that we all agree in the sense that we need to identify or come up with a new modality for civic participation in this particular case through e-voting. This has been a heartfelt demand, and even though there's some legislation and the National Electoral Institute has made efforts to regulate it, that will also give an opportunity to other fellow citizens residing in other places like those in the US. One of their main demands, which is a part of a long list of demands or petitions, is this. Their main demand is the right to vote. That's one of their main demands. They said we want the right conditions so that we can cast our votes. We want to participate in the decisions regarding our country. And that's a right that we need to take into account. This is something mentioned by Dr. Astudillo because he said that we're talking about digital rights. Yes, there are digital rights, but beyond that, we could say that they are human rights. It's a human right to have it's a human right to be able to participate in elections digitally. Also, a few days ago, also at a diploma course that we're participating in at the Electoral Tribunal of the Judiciary. Um, some people shared some thoughts about the advantages and disadvantages of changing or modifying a constitution, specifically Article 35, to facilitate the participation of citizens and promoting this new mechanism that involves the use of technologies that are already available in our country. On one hand, they said that, or you said that the process may be expensive. And some people have made reference to the high cost of purchasing these machines. And you have also explained how it could be really difficult. I'm talking about the need for control. Some speakers have already explored or uh, told us about the possibility of control mechanisms so that we can give certainty to citizens and decision makers to promote this participation mechanism.
Just a minute, please. I think we are going to be able to share the screen now. So the topic is electronic voting possibilities and challenges for its instrumentation. As we can see in our country, we have the judicial backup of 1911 in the electoral law known as the Madero Law, because in Article 31, it talks about the use of automatic voting machines. The other reference is in the law Carranza of federal powers. In Article 58, it refers to automatic machines and the requirements that they should meet. This modality of voting took place in the electoral law of 1946, 1951, and 1973 in Articles 76, 86, and 140 accordingly, and in Article 188 of the Federal Law of Political Organizations and Electoral Processes. For many years, we have been trying to implement different types of mechanisms of voting, alternative to paper voting. Both the Federal Code of Elections and of Institutions and Procedures in its reform of 2008 did not allude to the possibility of receiving votes through means of some kind of electronic ballot box. Voting in Mexico currently is not considering the use of electronic ballot box or other types of e-voting. However, we can see that it has been considered already with some work that the local body has done. For example, in Coahuila, and it also mentions that in the Electoral Institute, it is legislated to be able to allow nationals abroad to vote electronically. When we talk about Coahuila, Jalisco, and Mexico City, these are the most advanced in implementing this mechanism. And they also instrument these mechanisms with public bodies, local bodies of Mexico City, Baja California Sur, Nuevo León, San Luis Potosí, Veracruz, Michoacán, Chiapas, Chihuahua, and Campeche. In which regulation should e-voting be regulated? In the Article 35 of the Political Constitution of the Mexican United States, and modify the general law of institutions and electoral procedures to instrument electronic mechanisms in the federal electoral processes. The transition towards modern electoral procedures in which we use digital means to instrument the possibility of voting through electronic devices will go through an analysis and discussion in the parliament and with the participation of academia and open forums that are already being developed. However, I would like to mention that Cesar Asturillo stated something that lifts some of the weight away from us. So it's not just the legislature having to make decisions and modifying the way citizens participate in electoral processes. He mentions that we can legislate in local bodies. And I think it's very interesting that it's not necessary to have to modify Article 35, but that electoral bodies also have the power to turn this e-voting possibility into a reality, and it's needed by vulnerable groups as well. There are constitutional initiatives for electoral political reforms. The first initiative is that of the Mexican president that was sent to our commission on April 29th, 2022. In this, it refers to taking advantage of IT technologies and communication technologies to vote during elections, popular referendums, as well as recall voting. Secondly, the initiative of the Parliament Group of the Partido del Trabajo was sent to this commission on May 1st, 2022, where it mentions the use of electronic means to vote in electoral matters. The third initiative of political electoral reforms for e-voting is presented by Manuel Alejandro Robles Gomez Morena, which reforms Article Article 329 and 332 of the General Law of Institutions and Electoral Procedures. It refers to the fact that voting electronically on behalf of nationals abroad for referendum and consultations is excluding federal elections. When we adopt voting through electronic means in a generalized way, we must analyze the possibilities that we have, like, for example, lower expenses, shorter times to learn about the results, more citizen participation, etc. A clear example is seen in India and Brazil that are using e-ballots in a generalized way in their local and federal elections in their countries. In the open parliament forums, the experiences that have been shared in these discussions is that in August of the recent year, we had a proposal where they analyzed the Mexican electoral system with the use of e-voting. And in this event, we had experts presenting positions in favor or against these electronic devices. Among the advantages that we do have is the fact that we can use electronic means that avoid concentrations of people. It allows us to quickly have the electoral results with a high level of certainty, and they can be used in other activities such as popular referendums or recall referendum following the principle of austerity. Among the disadvantages, there are few electronic voting models. Costs are very high to operate it. We can have failures because of the electronic atmospheric environment. In the operation of the ballot boxes, there is a complexity in its implementation. Not all places have the characteristics. This was also already mentioned among disadvantages. Not all places have the physical characteristics to set up the ballot box. We have to have the technical backup to ensure that the identity of the voter is verified. And those that are contributing neutral opinions say that no mechanism can be completely bulletproof. So we must design a document in which it's clarified how we collect and count the electronic votes. And another opinion is that the security elements of data privacy, which are referring to the information of the voters, is how their ID is verified, and we can have cybersecurity, but protect them against hacking. However, we can see that even though we can use them in other activities, such as popular referendums, following the principle of austerity, it was also mentioned that you can't just have simulated opinions that you're going to save money, because like our moderator mentioned, the large amount of money that we would have to invest to set up these electronic polling stations with more than 11 billion pesos. So the conclusions that we can come to is that this is a topic that's very important, that should be discussed and that's put on the table to be able to analyze and understand the advantages according to our reality. Because yes, of course, it is true that it would represent a very high cost, but we could also see that this high cost could be reduced if we implement e-voting, not only in general, but that it could be voted it could be implemented gradually for voting districts, and we can do it gradually towards electronic voting. And then we can go towards assessment processes of audits to see how feasible it is and what results could we expect. We must have a higher level of trust as Mexicans, where technologies have passed us, where the background that we see have represented obstacles, and it's not feasible to continue doing things exactly the same way. We should not be maintaining electoral processes that are very expensive as well. And we also have some doubts. We have not had full certainty in all electoral processes. So we must go forward. We have to see how necessary it is for us to go forward, because we could also have other disadvantages. I think that one that should be considered would be going forward with technologies, because yes, it's true that we have very specific ballots, but it is true that a telephone device that we have in 6 months is no longer updated. Technology goes faster than us. So this topic is on the table for discussion, and of course, all of your contributions in favor and against this mechanism is allowing us to have that possibility of implementing this e-voting. And all of you have made very important contributions. Thank you. I want to say thank you, because the diversity of opinions enrich this environment of what we want to modify and transform. You are the experts and the support that we need. So on my behalf, that is all. I want to say thank you to the speakers and the moderator of this amazing event. It is very clear what the advantages and disadvantages are to be able to go forward in a new model of voting in Mexico. I apologize, because due to agenda restraints, I will not be able to be here in the Q&A session. But please feel free to email me your questions, and I will be glad to answer any questions you may have. I want to say thank you to Ine. Thank you all very much for your amazing participation. Congress Lady, thank you so much for your presentation. I found your presentation very enriching, where we were able to go through the whole background of this. I did not know that we had a background that started in 1911. And I also want to say thank you for being so objective in your analysis when you talk about the advantages and disadvantages. In the disadvantages, you also mentioned the high cost that this could entail. I think it's fundamental that this debate, we look at the experience of local electoral bodies that have already done the implementation of e-voting with various devices, like the Electoral Institute of Mexico City, that has implemented mechanisms for participation since 2012. They have had internet voting since 2014. In 7 occasions, the citizens of Mexico City have participated in mixed formats for participative budget making. When we talk about internet voting, we must consider that citizens register in that modality directly, and they can vote an anticipated matter. However, before 2018, we had an atypical participation via internet, which in 2014 went over 137,000 votes. In that occasion, it's when we had the highest number of votes. This was contrasting the case at the first 4 occasions in which the citizens were able to participate via internet. The votes presented represented 19% of the participation. So we must pay attention to the elections of 2014 and 16 because aside from the budgeting, they elected citizen representatives. And in the elections of 2016, there were scandals, votes being bought and people being forced to vote in a certain way. Among the practices that the Electoral Institute of Mexico City dealt with that have to do with internet, we saw that there were massive purchasing of cellular chips, as well as people being taken to cyber cafes. And then in 2020, they had electronic voting on tablets for the participatory budget and the commissions of communities. The Electoral Institute of Mexico City implemented electronic ballot box. It was just an iPad in Cuauhtemoc and Miguel Hidalgo. For that activity in Mexico City, the Electoral Institute determined that 100% of the polling stations would be done electronically, meaning a tablet with a preloaded system. However, there was a chain of errors that came from the design of the system itself. The first error had to do with the programming. If the system was rebooted, and if that was the case, the session would not be closed. And the only drill that took place included 30% of the loading, and the known errors were micro. On the day of the election, since the polling stations opened up on the same time, the system could not hold on to all the information and caused failed when the iPads were turned on of all the polling stations simultaneously. In the training of the delegation of Cuauhtemoc, they did not tell them about the chain error. They rebooted the system and the session was open again. Then they rebooted it and no new session was open. So it like three-folded all the sessions, and they did not have any paper ballots so people could vote traditionally with these errors. And the contingency plan, which was to have paper ballots, took up to 4 hours to be implemented. So these elections were annulled and they had to be repeated. So it's very important to see the cases of success to learn from them, but also these cases in which we have learned of deficiencies to ensure we don't follow the same mistakes. The Congress lady has to leave because she has other agenda restraints, but she has shared an email with us. If you have any questions, you can send it to her. It's reforma.politicoelectoral@diputados.gov.mx. Also, Ms. Lázaro said that at 1:35, she had to also leave to go to an institutional meeting that she has. I see that we are almost out of time, so I'm going to read the questions that we have for Astudillo and Leiva so that they can address the questions very briefly. The questions are, you mentioned a large amount to purchase electronic ballot boxes. Do you have to buy them for each election? In the case of Mexico, what would be the approximate cost if you included e-voting in 2 modalities, electronically and internet voting? How is electronic voting legislated in Mexico? Because I see that in some states they already do e-voting. Do you consider that e-voting has to focus on devices or on the model of voting? So I now give the floor to Mr. Astudillo. Thank you very much, Counselor. We are having sound issues. Can you hear me now? No. Maybe you would have to turn off video.
No, a ver. Sí, ya la quité. Ahí se escucha mejor.
Ligeramente mejor, temo
A ver,
decir.
Me voy a conectar desde el teléfono en consecuencia. Te
Well,
pediría
since you cannot hear me, can we please give the floor to Dr. Leyva? I'm going to connect on my phone. Thank you.
Es claro que si el INE compra
We can hear you now. Okay.
urnas
It's
electrónicas,
clear that if INE
muy
has to buy electronic ballot boxes, it's a huge investment. But if there is a shared decision,
posible entre los 33 organizar elecciones en el país, el costo bajaría
with the
claramente.
states, the cost would go down, especially following the idea of just one polling station where we could use just one electronic ballot box for the different modalities. That would be the first point. How are we regulated? We are a federal entity, so we have a regulation that has national scope, but it also has a regulation for federal entities. So I think it would be worthwhile that through a very specific guideline like the one that I am proposing, to determine that the regulation of electronic voting be with INE, and based on that, we can have specific development for federal entities through their electoral bodies. This does not mean that they are enabled to legislate, but that they are being used with their regulation that is recognized and that needs to be strengthened, legally speaking. So in that line of thought, I think that we have to once again back up the virtuality of our federal model through elections so that with the coordination between INE and state authorities, it can be easier to reach the objective of implementing this model. That would be all of my intervention. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Astudillo. So we now give the floor to Mr. Leyva so you can conclude. Thank you very much. Well, when we talk about costs, obviously, just like you stated, and based on the experience in Colombia, there is a large investment, and this has to be done gradually to have electronic terminals for voting. So in Colombia, we have been implementing technology in the different stages of our electoral processes. We have the implementation of biometric systems that have been accepted by our citizens because there has always been distrust regarding vote stealing and in the voter registry. So these technologies entail investment, of course. Now I want to talk about purchasing these machines. And as electoral bodies, we have to consider the pertinence of buying these machines because the technological implementation and the progress and the development takes place so quickly. And it's like what I was saying at the beginning. We have to make regulatory reforms to accept technology, but then technology goes forward and then in regulations we can fall behind. So something that seems very modern today is becoming obsolete before we know it because technology is going forward so fast. So as electoral bodies, we could end up with all these machines that in just 5 or 10 years are no longer going to be relevant for traceability and reliability and availability of the information. So following this line of ideas, this investment is necessary, of course, but yes, we have to consider the cost of investment, but we also have savings in the amount of paper that we use in manual processes. And this cost can not only be financially assess, but also the environmental damage, because we use so much paper under traditional voting or manual voting that most of the Latin American countries follow. So obviously, we must plan it clearly, financially speaking, as well as environmental aspects. And obviously, every time we want to update a regulation, we must have the certainty that we will be able to take it to a reality, because we have the budget on behalf of the governments that are going to implement it, and that there is a consensus in the government to guarantee the necessary resources to invest in these technologies. This is how I close. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Leiva. Thank you so much for your participation. Thank you to all the panelists. It was very fruitful to listen to all of you. I have many new learnings in compared law with the experiences of Argentina and Colombia. Thank you to all of you following us on our YouTube channel. And this is how we conclude this event for today. Thank you very much. The National Electoral Institute thanks of all the participants of this forum on electronic voting, possibilities and challenges of its implementation for Mexico. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. Mexico City time, we will begin with experiences internationally speaking with e-voting and implementation of e-voting in Latin America. So I wish you a wonderful afternoon. Thank you very much. It's my turn tomorrow.
Ah, saludos.